The story of the Qin begins in the shadows, not in glory. If you picture ancient China before Qin Shi Huang's thunderous rise, you can almost imagine a vast chessboard cracked into dozens of pieces. It wasn't one empire, not even close. It was a patchwork of squabbling states, each with its own king, its own ambitions, and its own schemes. Historians call this the Warring States period, and the name really doesn't exaggerate anything. Warfare was the heartbeat of the age. Borders shifted as often as the seasons, and allegiances lasted only as long as they were useful. Picture generals sitting around campfires at night, scribbling new plans on bamboo slips, already plotting how to outwit an ally before that ally could betray them. That's the atmosphere in which Qin first stepped onto the stage. Now, let's be honest, the Qin weren't supposed to be the winners. They were tucked away in the western reaches, a little rough around the edges compared to the more sophisticated central states like Chu, Qi, or Zhao. People from the east even looked down on them, dismissing them as semi-barbarians who raised horses and fought like brutes. If ancient China had a high school cafeteria, Qin would have been the kid eating lunch alone at the far table, scorned by the cool cliques. And yet, sometimes it's the outsider who's underestimated for just long enough to grow strong in the dark. That Western isolation gave Qin two things the central states lacked: space and resilience. Space, because the Qin homeland stretched toward the rugged Lus Plateau and beyond, open land that let them raise hardy soldiers and horses. Resilience, because being mocked and pushed aside tends to forge a kind of stubborn pride. The Qin weren't polished, but they were determined, and determination has a way of outlasting polish. Think of Rome when it was just a scrappy city on the Tiber, looked down on by the Greeks, dismissed by the Etruscans, yet quietly preparing to dominate them all. Qin's story has that same ring. Still, in those early days, no one betting on China's future would have put their money on Qin. The dominant states, Chu with its vast fertile lands, Qi with its wealth, Zhao with its disciplined armies, looked much more promising. Qin seemed peripheral, its king's minor players invited to the occasional diplomatic meeting, but never taken seriously. Even its early rulers seemed resigned to staying in the background. They clung to survival, trying to keep their borders secure, fending off raids, and occasionally throwing their lot in with stronger powers. The dream of ruling all China? That wasn't even on the horizon. But here's the twist. Times of chaos are fertile ground for innovation. The Warring States wasn't just about armies clashing, it was about ideas colliding. Philosophers, reformers, and visionaries traveled from court to court, pitching new ways to govern, fight, and survive. Confucian scholars preached morality and proper ritual, trying to tame the wildness of war with the order of tradition. Taoist thinkers whispered of harmony and retreat from the world's madness. And then there were the legalists, hard-nosed pragmatists who believed only strict laws and ruthless discipline could bring order. Qin, desperate and willing to try what others wouldn't, listened closely to those voices. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before the legalist reforms turned Qin into a war machine, it was just another struggling state. Its rulers had to worry about enemies pressing in on every side. The land wasn't the richest, the culture wasn't the most refined, and the armies weren't the most feared. Yet beneath the surface, there was a raw toughness brewing. Generations of frontier warfare and rough living made the Qin people hardened. They weren't soft courtiers sipping wine in silk robes. They were farmers with calloused hands, soldiers who knew hunger, men and women who endured cold winds sweeping down from the west. That kind of environment doesn't produce luxury, it produces grit. And grit, as history loves to remind us, can be the seed of greatness. It's a little like watching a marathon. The frontrunners grab attention early, their stride smooth, their pace commanding. But sometimes, it's the runner in the middle of the pack, unnoticed, conserving strength, who surprises everyone in the final miles. Qin was that runner, panting, overlooked, but steady. What's fascinating here is the irony. Qin's obscurity was its strength. Because they weren't at the center of power, they had more freedom to experiment. Because they were dismissed, rivals didn't always see them as a threat until it was too late. And because life was harsher on their frontier, they learned discipline the hard way. In many ways, Qin's early disadvantage mirrored the underdog stories we still love today: David versus Goliath, Rocky Balboa going the distance, the small startup that outsmarts the big corporations. Except here, the stakes weren't a boxing match or market share. It was who would hold sway over one of the largest and most enduring civilizations in history. Yet, at this point in the story, Qin's rise wasn't obvious. Their kings were still minor, their armies still scrambling, their ambitions still uncertain. But the conditions for change were all there: a chaotic age demanding new solutions, a resilient people hardened by geography, and a simmering pride waiting to be kindled. You could almost feel the ground trembling, though few realized it. Qin was sharpening its blade in silence, and one day, that blade would cut through the heart of the warring states. When you think about great transformations in history, it's tempting to picture moments of inspiration: kings dreaming beneath the stars, generals rallying troops with fiery speeches, philosophers scribbling world-changing ideas by candlelight. Qin's transformation wasn't that kind of story. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't gentle. It was brutal, methodical, and deeply pragmatic. And at the center of it stood one man, Xiangyang. His reforms were the turning point, the hinge that swung Qin from obscurity to dominance, and they came with a sharp edge that cut both ways. Let's set the stage. By the 4th century BCE, Qin's rulers had realized something uncomfortable: survival wasn't guaranteed. Their armies were often outmatched, their influence mocked, and their state lagged behind the central powers. Something had to change, and not just a little cosmetic adjustment. They needed a full teardown and rebuild, a rethinking of what a state could be. Enter Xiangyang, a thinker of the legalist school, who believed society couldn't be run on noble ideals or moral persuasion alone. People, in his view, weren't naturally virtuous. They were selfish, easily swayed, and prone to laziness if given the chance. Sound harsh? It was, but Xiangyang didn't shy from harshness. He embraced it. His pitch to the Qin ruler was radical: if you want a strong state, you can't trust human nature. You have to bind it with laws so strict, so unavoidable, that no one dares step out of line. Rewards should be clear, punishments even clearer. Favoritism, privilege, noble birth, those had no place in his system. Only results mattered. A farmer who grew more grain or a soldier who killed more enemies deserved honor. A nobleman who slacked deserved punishment just like a commoner. It was cold, logical, and revolutionary. And Qin, desperate to claw its way into relevance, took the gamble. The reforms began with agriculture, the backbone of everything. Xiangyang understood that a state lived or died on the strength of its food supply. Grain meant soldiers could march, cities could grow, and wars could be fought. So he restructured landholding. No longer could aristocrats sit idly, sipping wine on inherited estates while peasants toiled without incentive. Instead, land was divided more rationally, farmers were directly rewarded for output, and surplus grain meant social mobility. In essence, he tied personal success to the productivity of the fields. Work harder, produce more, climb higher. Slack off and face penalties. It sounds like a ruthless version of a corporate performance review system, except the penalty wasn't a lost bonus. It could mean fines, loss of land, or even physical punishment. But Xiangyang didn't stop at agriculture. He went after the very fabric of society. Families, once sprawling and diffuse, were reorganized into tightly controlled units. The principle was simple: collective responsibility. If one member of a household broke the law, the others suffered too. It sounds draconian, and it was, but it meant people policed each other relentlessly. You couldn't just shrug off your cousin's misbehavior. It might bring punishment to your whole clan. Fear, in Xiangyang's system, wasn't just vertical from ruler to subject, it radiated horizontally among neighbors and kin. And then came the military. Here, Xiangyang was ruthless in stripping away old privileges. In many states, noble birth automatically gave you rank and command. Not in Qin after his reforms. Military meritocracy was enforced with iron clarity: kill an enemy, earn a title. Capture a head, gain land. Fail, and no pedigree could save you. This created a fierce, almost transactional warrior culture. Soldiers fought not just for glory, but for tangible rewards. Each battle became a chance to climb the ladder, to rewrite your fate. The noble-born officer who coasted on family name? He suddenly found himself shoulder to shoulder with a farmer's son whose courage and kill count had catapulted him upward. Equality, yes, but equality in a furnace of violence. Legal codes under Shangyang hardened like steel. Laws were written down, enforced without exception, and applied to everyone. This wasn't justice in the modern sense. It wasn't about fairness or mercy. It was about predictability. You knew the rules, and you knew the punishment. Break a minor law, face lashes. Break a major one, lose your life. There was no wriggle room, no loophole, no cozying up to officials for leniency. It was terrifying, but it was also stabilizing. In an age where corruption and favoritism were rampant in other states, Qin's cold impartiality stood out. People may not have loved the system, but they feared it, and fear made them obey. Of course, none of this made Qin popular. Other states sneered at Shangyang's legalism, calling it inhumane. Confucians, with their emphasis on virtue and benevolence, recoiled at the brutality. Imagine a modern workplace run by a boss who tracks every keystroke, times every bathroom break, and punishes entire teams for one person's mistake. That was Shangyang's Qin. Efficient? Absolutely. Warm? Not in the slightest. But when survival's on the line, efficiency sometimes wins over warmth. The reforms worked. Slowly, Qin's economy grew stronger. Its armies became sharper, more disciplined, and hungrier for reward. Its bureaucracy expanded, filled with officials loyal not to noble clans but to the state itself. Shangyang had created a machine, a cold, grinding, relentless machine designed for conquest. And like any machine, it didn't care about the comfort of its parts. The people suffered, yes, but the state thrived. There's a dark irony here. Shangyang himself eventually fell victim to the very system he built. After the death of his patron ruler, enemies at court turned on him. He was accused of treason, hunted down, and executed, torn apart by chariots, according to some accounts. A gruesome end, but one that fit the ruthless logic of his laws. No one, not even the architect, stood above them. Yet, even in death, Shangyang's blueprint endured. Qin didn't abandon his system, it doubled down on it. His reforms had carved the path forward, and there was no turning back. Think of it this way. Qin before Shangyang was a scrappy but unimpressive runner in the marathon of the warring states. After Shangyang, it became a disciplined athlete trained on a punishing regimen, ready to outlast and outfight the competition. The others might have scoffed at Qin's harshness, but scoffing doesn't win wars. Qin was no longer the outsider at the cafeteria table. It was preparing to flip the table over entirely. Legalism wasn't just a policy in Qin, it became the state's bloodstream. Imagine a society where kindness is seen as weakness, where mercy is not a virtue but a liability, and where the highest good isn't harmony or moral cultivation, but sheer obedience to law. That's what Qin became. Shangyang had planted the seeds, but over time those seeds grew into a forest so dense, so unyielding, that it swallowed almost every other idea. Now, let's pause for a second. In most stories of political philosophy, we hear about balance. Confucianism, for example, talked about virtue, hierarchy, respect for parents, and ritual as the glue that held society together. Taoism encouraged flowing with the natural order, stepping back, finding peace. But legalism? It didn't care about balance. It didn't whisper about harmony or moral cultivation. It shouted, people respond to punishment and reward, nothing else matters. To a legalist, the problem with other systems was simple. They expected too much nobility out of human beings. Shangyang and his successors thought, why gamble on human decency when you can guarantee obedience with fear? And Qin rulers bought into that wholeheartedly. They didn't just enforce laws, they built a culture around the idea that law was everything. Break it, and you weren't just a criminal, you were a threat to the stability of the state itself. And stability, in the Qin worldview, was sacred. This wasn't the soft, moralizing stability of Confucian order, where elders guided the young and rulers acted like benevolent fathers. No, This was the stability of a dam holding back a flood, every stone pressed tight, every leak sealed with harsh precision. To make sure the law was inescapable, Qin officials extended its reach into every crack of life. Farmers couldn't shirk planting, soldiers couldn't desert without catastrophic consequences, merchants were watched closely, and scholars were expected to serve the state rather than question it. Responsibility wasn't just individual, it was collective. If your neighbor broke the law and you didn't report him, you were guilty too. This fostered a society where suspicion ran deep, where families monitored each other, and where silence could be deadly. Paranoia wasn't a bug in the system, it was a feature. You can almost hear the tension it created. On the one hand, it produced results: fields full of grain, armies marching in lockstep, borders secure, coffers full. On the other, it suffocated personal freedom. People didn't just obey because they wanted to, they obeyed because disobedience meant ruin, not only for themselves, but for their kin. Can you imagine living like that? Every action weighed, every word monitored, every relationship laced with fear of betrayal. It's chilling, but for Qin, it worked. The key insight of legalism was this: the state must be stronger than the individual. Compassion for one person could endanger the stability of all. If a farmer was tool to work, the law still demanded his quota. If a soldier faltered in battle, no excuse would save him. And if an official bent the rules, even slightly, punishment was swift. Legalists believed that by treating everyone equally harshly, the state avoided favoritism, and favoritism was poison. In their minds, society couldn't be built on goodwill or kindness because those were unreliable. Only uniform, inflexible law could level the playing field. Here's the strange thing: many ordinary people, at least at first, respected Qin's legalist approach. Sure, it was terrifying. But in a world where noble families often abused their power, where corruption was rampant, and where wars devastated whole provinces, Qin's cold impartiality felt cleaner. Imagine living in a place where the local lord could do whatever he pleased, where justice was just another word for bribes and connections. Compared to that, a system where the law punished noble and peasant alike, harshly, yes, but predictably, was almost refreshing. It was the devil you knew, but at least it was consistent. Still, this consistency came at a cost. Legalism stripped away humanity in favor of efficiency. Confucian scholars complained bitterly that it destroyed filial piety and moral cultivation. They argued that without compassion, society was a machine without a soul. But Qin rulers weren't looking for souls, they were looking for power. And power, legalism delivered. The bureaucracy grew into a finely tuned apparatus where officials were rewarded for performance, punished for failure, and constantly reminded that loyalty was owed only to the state, never to personal ties. Think of it like a factory line, running day and night. Every worker has a station, every part has a function, and if one cog breaks, it's swiftly replaced. The machine doesn't care if the worker is tired, hungry, or grieving. It only cares that the product keeps rolling out. Qin society became that kind of machine, and the product was conquest. But let's not pretend everyone accepted this quietly. There were grumbles, of course. Families mourning harsh punishments, farmers resenting quotas, soldiers weary of endless campaigns. Yet fear kept those grumbles small. Dissent didn't survive long in a legalist system. To question the law was to question the state, and to question the state was to invite death. In a way, Qin perfected what we might call today a surveillance state, long before the term existed. No technology, no cameras, but plenty of human eyes, neighbors, relatives, local officials, all watching, all compelled by collective responsibility. What makes this fascinating is the long shadow it cast. Even after Qin fell, later dynasties couldn't quite shake off legalist principles. They might soften them with Confucian rhetoric or Taoist ideas, but the core belief, that strong, centralized law was necessary to hold a vast empire together, remained. You could say Qin's embrace of legalism permanently bent the arc of Chinese governance. Compassion and morality would always be invoked, but beneath the surface, the steel of legalist order endured. So here we have Qin in the aftermath of Shangyang's reforms, a state that had not just flirted with legalism, but married it outright. The laws were severe, the punishments merciless, but the results undeniable. Qin was growing stronger, richer, and more disciplined. The people bent beneath the weight of the law, but the state stood tall. It raises the uncomfortable question: is stability worth the cost of humanity? Qin answered yes emphatically. And for a while, it seemed like they were right. The legalist machine was humming, and soon it would propel Qin from the margins of the warring states to the very center of power. But as we'll see, machines built on fear can't run forever without breaking down. When you picture emperors, you often imagine them in their prime, commanding armies, sitting on gilded thrones, issuing decrees with a flick of the wrist. But emperors, like everyone else, start somewhere. Zhang's story begins not with triumph, but with fragility. He wasn't born into a peaceful palace. He came into a world still tangled in war, where every alliance was fragile, every shadow held potential betrayal, and even his legitimacy carried whispers of scandal. Zhang was born in 259 BCE, right in the thick of the warring states' chaos. His father, King Zichu, wasn't the most secure of Qin princes. In fact, he'd spent part of his life as a political hostage in the rival state of Zhao. Imagine that one day you're a royal son, the next you're essentially a bargaining chip living under the watch of your enemies. Zhang's mother, Lady Zhao, was caught in the same swirl of palace intrigue. The circumstances of his conception and early years were clouded in rumors, and some enemies would later use those whispers to question his bloodline. Was he truly the rightful heir of Qin? Or was he the pawn of a complicated affair while his father languished in Zhao? The questions hovered around him like gnats, and in an age where legitimacy was everything, those doubts could be fatal. The world he entered was harsh even for a royal child. Qin's legalist system had already reshaped the state, meaning the atmosphere was one of strict order, relentless discipline, and a constant edge of fear. This wasn't the pampered court of a Confucian ideal, where noble sons were trained in ritual and poetry. Zhang's upbringing was closer to a boot camp than a finishing school. Survival was lesson 1. Trust was lesson 2, except that in Qin, trust was rationed like water in a drought. When he was still a boy, tragedy struck. His father died, leaving him king at just 13 years old. Imagine it. Barely a teenager, still growing into his own body, suddenly responsible for an entire kingdom in the most cutthroat era China had ever seen. 13-year-olds today worry about exams or fitting in at school. Zhang worried about assassination plots, traitorous ministers, and rival states waiting for Qin's weakness. It's almost absurd when you think about it. The pressure must have been suffocating, yet it was also formative. Youth hardened him, forced him to mature in ways no child should. Of course, at first, Zhang wasn't in full control. Regents and ministers ruled in his name, and palace politics swirled around him like sharks circling blood. One of the most notorious figures was Lu Bue, a powerful merchant-turned-politician who had maneuvered his way into influence, possibly even engineering Zhang's path to the throne. Lu Bue was shrewd, calculating, and ambitious, some say too ambitious. He filled the young king's court with his allies, guided policy, and presented himself as indispensable. To some, he was a mentor. To others, a puppet master pulling the strings of a boy king. But here's where Zhang begins to stand out. Unlike so many young monarchs who became pawns of stronger men, he didn't stay in anyone's shadow for long. Even in his teens, he showed a fierce will, a sharp eye for betrayal, and a cold determination to cut down rivals before they cut him. Slowly, carefully, he chipped away at Lu Bue's influence. He distanced himself from his mother when her own political entanglements threatened scandal. He made it clear that he, and he alone, would be king. By the time he came of age, the boy had already learned one of history's harshest lessons: power can't be shared, not if you mean to hold it. This instinct for control was more than just personal ambition, it was perfectly in tune with Qin's legalist philosophy. Remember, Qin's system thrived on centralization, on eliminating divided loyalties. A ruler who hesitated, who allowed factions to bloom unchecked, was asking for collapse. Yingzheng didn't hesitate. He embodied the legalist creed before he even wore the imperial crown. Obedience flowed upward, loyalty was demanded downward. Ministers weren't advisors to be courted, they were tools to be used and discarded if they wavered. And let's not miss the human side of this. Growing up in such a climate, Yingzheng became deeply distrustful. You can almost picture the young king walking through his palace halls, every whisper making him tense, every smile hiding potential treachery. The boy grew into a man with a hard shell, unwilling to rely on anyone completely. That paranoia, born of childhood insecurity and political danger, would never leave him. Later, as emperor, it would shape everything he did. From the surveillance state, he expanded to his desperate search for immortality. Yet, for all his suspicion, he was brilliant. He wasn't just a frightened child reacting to danger. He was an ambitious mind absorbing every lesson chaos had to offer. He studied military campaigns, bureaucratic reports, and the philosophies swirling through China. Unlike rulers who clung to tradition, Yingzheng seemed to recognize that his age demanded something new. He was ruthless enough to wield legalism without hesitation, but he was also visionary enough to see how Qin could use its discipline to seize what no one else had, all of China. So, when Yingzheng came of age, the stage was set. Qin was already a hardened state thanks to Shang Yang's reforms. Its armies were organized, its people drilled into obedience, its laws as unyielding as iron. All it needed was a leader who could push it past the tipping point. Yingzheng, shaped by a youth of danger and mistrust, was exactly that leader. His childhood wasn't a weakness, it was the forge that produced the man who would become Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. It's almost poetic, though in a grim way. The boy born under rumors, raised in suspicion, tested by palace intrigue, stepped into adulthood ready not just to survive but to conquer. He didn't want to be just another king in a long line of squabbling monarchs. He wanted to be something new, something the world had never seen. And soon, he would make that vision a reality. If Yingzheng's childhood was the forge, then war was the hammer that beat him and Qin into dominance. He'd grown up in a world where maps were written in ink but redrawn in blood. Every state in the Warring States period dreamed of being the one to unify China, but dreaming and doing are two very different things. Most kings were satisfied with surviving another generation, maybe winning a border skirmish here, losing one there. Yingzheng wasn't satisfied with survival. He wanted everything. Let's pause for a second and appreciate the scale of what he set out to do. Imagine Europe in the Middle Ages, fragmented into dozens of kingdoms: France, England, Spain, the Italian city-states, the Holy Roman Empire. Now imagine one king saying, "I will conquer them all. I will turn this continent into one empire under my rule." That's what Yingzheng was declaring in China, only his rivals weren't playing games. They were hardened states with professional armies, fortified cities, and centuries of tradition. To pull this off, he needed more than ambition. He needed a war machine, and thanks to Shang Yang's reforms and decades of legalist discipline, Qin had one. The campaigns began with calculated ferocity. Qin's armies weren't ragtag militias, they were disciplined, hierarchical, and motivated by reward. Soldiers earned rank by killing enemies, not by noble birth. Generals were chosen for ability, not pedigree. And Qin had an advantage in logistics. Roads and canals built under earlier kings allowed for the rapid movement of troops and supplies. While rival states often struggled to coordinate, Qin could mobilize like a modern army, marching tens of thousands with ruthless efficiency. One of Yingzheng's earliest major targets was Han. Small and weak compared to its neighbors, Han had long been a buffer state. For Qin, it was a low-hanging fruit. The conquest of Han in 230 BCE was swift, almost surgical. Han's king surrendered, its lands absorbed, and just like that, one rival was erased from the board. But the easy victories ended there. The next states would not fall so quietly. Zhao was next, and Zhao was no pushover. Its armies had a proud tradition, hardened by years of fighting the northern nomads. Zhao's soldiers were disciplined, their cavalry fierce. But Qin had something Zhao didn't: momentum and an almost industrial approach to war. The Battle of Chongqing years earlier had already devastated Zhao, with Qin forces slaughtering hundreds of thousands of surrendered troops in a display of sheer terror. That massacre wasn't forgotten. When Ing Zhang's armies pressed into Zhao again, the memory of Chongqing hung over everything like a dark cloud. Zhao fought desperately, but its strength had waned. By 228 BCE, Qin had captured Handan, Zhao's capital. Another rival swallowed. Wei fell next in 225 BCE, and here Qin demonstrated a chilling mix of brutality and ingenuity. The state of Wei was protected by strong defenses, particularly the city of Dalian. Instead of a direct assault, Qin engineers diverted the Yellow River, flooding the city and drowning hundreds of thousands. Think about that, not just defeating an army, but weaponizing nature itself to obliterate a population. It was warfare as horror, and it showed just how far Qin was willing to go. The biggest challenge, though, was Chu. She was vast, wealthy, and culturally distinct, with deep traditions and a huge population. Many believed it was simply too big to conquer. But Ing Zhang wasn't deterred. The Qin general Wang Jian, one of the greatest military minds of the age, was entrusted with the task. His strategy wasn't flashy, it was methodical. He requested an enormous army, some sources say 600,000 men, because he understood that beating Chu required overwhelming force. Qin granted it, and the campaign began. After fierce battles, including one where Wang Jian used deception to lure Chu forces into overextending, Chu collapsed in 223 BC. The fall of Chu was more than just a military victory, it was a psychological one. If Chu could fall, no state was safe. Yan and Qi followed. Yan tried a desperate gambit by sending an assassin, Jing Ku, to kill Ing Zhang, a story that has been told and retold in Chinese lore. Imagine the scene, the assassin presenting a map as a gift, a dagger hidden inside, lunging at the king. Ing Zhang barely survived, wrestling free and escaping. The attempt failed, but it revealed just how much fear Qin had inspired. Yan's lands were conquered not long after, and Qi, isolated and demoralized, surrendered without much resistance in 221 BC. In less than a decade, the map of China had been transformed. One by one, the independent states that had fought for centuries were absorbed into Qin. The process wasn't elegant, it was brutal, bloody, and merciless. Cities were destroyed, populations massacred or relocated, kings dethroned, traditions trampled. But through it all, Ing Zhang's vision never wavered. He wasn't interested in balance or coexistence. He wanted unification through conquest, and he got it. It's hard not to marvel at the scale of this achievement. For centuries, no one thought it possible. The warring states system seemed eternal, like an endless game of chess with no final checkmate. Ing Zhang changed that. He didn't just win a few battles, he ended the game entirely. And when the dust settled, for the first time in history, all the lands we now call China were under one ruler. Of course, the cost was staggering. Rivers of blood had been spilled, entire populations displaced, fear and exhaustion etched into the faces of survivors. But in Qin's logic, the cost was justified. Unity was priceless, and Ing Zhang was the man who delivered it. From this moment on, he would no longer be just king of Qin. He would take on a new title, one that no man before him had dared claim, Shi Huangdi, the first emperor. By 221 BCE, the world had changed, or at least, the Chinese world as people knew it. For generations, the warring states had been locked in what felt like an eternal struggle, each king convinced his state might one day rule them all. But as one state after another fell to Qin's relentless campaigns, Han, Zhao, Wei, Chu, Yan, Qi, the dream that once seemed impossible was now reality. For the first time in history, the land stretching from the steppes of the north to the rice fields of the south, from the rugged western hills to the eastern coast, was under the authority of a single man. Ing Zhang had done what no ruler before him had managed. He had ended the age of states. He had forged a single empire. And yet, conquering was only half the battle. What do you do once you've won? You can't simply keep ruling as the king of Qin. That title tied him to one state among many, a provincial ruler in a world that no longer existed. Yingzheng needed something greater, something that declared to everyone, friend, foe, subject, and history itself, that this was not just another king. This was something new. So he turned to the past, to the myths of the ancient sage kings who were said to have ruled in ages so distant they'd become half legend. These figures were called 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, San Huang Wu Di, and their names carried a kind of mystical authority. Kings came and went. But Huang, sovereign, and Di, emperor, were titles of cosmic weight, tied not just to power but to heaven itself. Yingzheng blended those titles and crowned himself Huangdi emperor. But he didn't stop there. He styled himself Shi Huangdi, the first emperor, declaring openly that there would be a line of emperors after him, stretching through the ages, a dynasty of absolute rulers unmatched in history. It was a bold move, and it worked. With that single declaration, Yingzheng severed ties with the fractured past and positioned himself as the foundation of a new world order. No more warring states. No more rival kings. From now on, there was one emperor, one throne, one China. But here's the thing, unifying the land wasn't just about titles or proclamations. Armies could conquer, but swords couldn't govern. The real challenge lay in stitching together dozens of cultures, dialects, laws, currencies, and traditions into something coherent. Imagine trying to merge not just countries, but entire civilizations with their own identities. That was the scale of the problem Qin faced. And here's where the genius and the ruthlessness of Yingzheng and his ministers truly showed. First, they tackled language. In a land where dozens of scripts and dialects flourished, communication across provinces was a nightmare. The Qin standardized written characters, creating a script that officials across the empire could understand. It didn't matter if you spoke a different tongue, the written word became uniform. This was more than convenience, it was power. With a unified script, orders from the capital could be read and enforced everywhere. It's no exaggeration to say that China's long history of cultural unity owes much to this single decision. Then came weights and measures. Before Qin, every state had its own system, different units for length, volume, currency. Trade across borders was messy, riddled with disputes. Qin imposed strict standards, one system of measurement, one currency, one set of rules. Suddenly, a merchant in the far south could measure grain the same way as one in the north, and taxes could be collected without confusion. Again, it sounds technical, almost boring, but in practice it was revolutionary. Where chaos had reigned, uniformity brought order. The infrastructure followed. Qin engineers expanded roads and canals, creating the veins through which the empire's lifeblood flowed. Roads allowed troops to march quickly to crush rebellions, but they also linked markets, shrines, and villages in ways that hadn't been possible before. Canals carried goods, irrigation fed crops, and the empire's vast resources began to move with a new kind of efficiency. It was as if the empire had grown a skeleton and bloodstream overnight. Of course, this unification wasn't achieved with a gentle hand. Local traditions, cherished customs, even the authority of nobles, all were bulldozed in favor of central control. The Qin system didn't tolerate fragmentation. Governors and officials were appointed by the emperor, loyal only to him. Local aristocracies were stripped of power. Families were relocated to prevent resistance. This wasn't a federation or alliance, it was centralization in its purest form. Qin wasn't interested in partnership. Qin wanted obedience. And yet, despite the harshness, there was awe. For ordinary farmers, merchants, and craftsmen, the wars had ended. After centuries of armies trampling their fields, burning their homes, and demanding tribute for rival kings, there was now one authority, one law. Taxes were still heavy, labor still demanded, punishments still cruel, but there was also a sense of something unprecedented, peace. The constant churn of war, the endless uncertainty of shifting borders, was finally still. For the first time in living memory, people could look at a map and know where they stood. That mattered. Yingzheng understood the symbolism of what he had achieved. He wasn't just a conqueror, he was a founder. His court celebrated him with grandeur, his decrees carried across the empire like thunder, and his name became etched into history as Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor. He saw himself not as a man ruling for a lifetime, but as the start of an eternal line. His obsession with immortality, which would come later, made sense in this light. He wasn't content with unity for a moment, he wanted it forever. And so, in 221 BCE, the world tilted. The Warring States period was over. The Qin Dynasty was born. The first emperor sat on his throne in Xianyang, master of all he surveyed, convinced that he had ended the chaos of the past and forged a new age of order. It's hard to overstate how monumental this moment was. In one sweep, China was transformed from a chessboard of feuding kingdoms into an empire that would, despite all its future upheavals, remain unified in identity for millennia. Even when Qin itself collapsed in just 15 years, the idea it birthed, the idea of one China, one emperor, one state, would endure. Every dynasty that followed, from Han to Tang to Ming to Qing, stood in Qin's shadow. So when we speak of Yingzheng becoming the first emperor, we're not just marking a date. We're witnessing the birth of a political idea so powerful it outlived the man, the dynasty, even the centuries of war that came after. In 221 BCE, a teenager turned king turned conqueror reinvented the very meaning of rulership. He was no longer just Yingzheng of Qin. He was Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of a united China. Up until 221 BCE, every ruler in the Chinese world was called Wang King. It was a title with roots stretching back centuries, wrapped in the authority of the Zhou dynasty, which had once claimed to hold the mandate of heaven. But kingship, as tradition framed it, had limits. A king was one among equals. He might be powerful, he might hold sway over vast lands, but in the Warring States period, the title of Wang didn't make you supreme, it made you a competitor. There were many kings, each fighting for dominance. And that, in Yingzheng's eyes, was exactly the problem. When the last rival fell and the map was his alone, Yingzheng stood before a world with no peers. No other kings, no rivals left to contest the throne. What use was the old title now? Calling himself Wang King would drag him back into the chaos he had just obliterated. He needed something new, something that separated him from the fractured past and announced a future that belonged only to him. So he did something radical. He took inspiration from the semi-mythical rulers of China's distant antiquity, the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors San Huang Wu Di. These weren't just men of power, they were culture bringers, figures of almost divine authority. The Huang and Di in their names carried cosmic weight, suggesting a connection not just to politics, but to heaven and earth themselves. Yingzheng fused those titles together into something unprecedented, Huangdi Emperor. But he didn't stop there. He added Shi first. Shi Huangdi, the first emperor. It wasn't just a personal boast. It was a framework, a prophecy, and a name. He was saying, I am the first in a line that will last for 10,000 generations. Think about the audacity of that. Not just ruling for his lifetime, not even securing power for his heirs, but laying claim to eternity. No one had ever done that before in Chinese history. The kings of old ruled until heaven withdrew its favor. The first emperor intended to reshape heaven's will entirely. The declaration was more than ceremonial. It rewrote the very relationship between ruler and ruled. Under the Zhou, the king was seen as the son of heaven, a moral figure who maintained balance between heaven, earth, and humanity. His legitimacy was conditional. If he failed in virtue, heaven's mandate could pass to another. Yingzheng rejected that conditionality outright. As emperor, his authority wasn't granted by heaven, it was heaven's authority manifest on earth. His word was law, unchallengeable, absolute. To question him wasn't just rebellion against a man, it was rebellion against the cosmos itself. And with that, the political culture of China was transformed. Ministers who once advised kings now served an emperor. Nobles who once jockeyed for semi-independent power now found their titles stripped, their lands redistributed, their autonomy crushed. The first emperor didn't want partners or peers. He wanted functionaries, tools, instruments of his will. The new order was centralized to the core, with every official answering upward, ultimately to him. For ordinary people, the change was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. On one hand, the wars were over. There was peace, a single authority. On the other hand, that authority felt distant, colossal, almost godlike. In villages and cities alike, people now lived under the gaze of a ruler they would never meet, whose decrees reached them through tablets of bamboo or bronze seals, yet whose power could decide their fate in an instant. Imagine being a farmer, hearing for the first time that you no longer lived under the king of Chu or Zhao or Qi, but under the emperor, the only one. It must have felt like the world itself had tilted. And Yingzheng knew how to lean into that awe. Rituals were redesigned. Palaces expanded. The court adopted new protocols to elevate the emperor above all others. He wasn't to be spoken of casually. He was an institution unto himself. Even language was reshaped. People were expected to use terms that magnified his supremacy, words dripping with reverence. He crafted not just a throne but a stage, and on that stage he was more than a man. He was the axis of the empire. It's worth pausing here to note how revolutionary this was. Think of how in Europe, for example, the Roman Republic collapsed into the Roman Empire. Augustus, the first emperor, carefully cloaked his new powers under old republican titles, easing people into the idea of empire. Yingzheng did the opposite. He broke with the past openly, smashed the old system, and declared something entirely new. He wasn't disguising his power, he was flaunting it. He wanted everyone to understand. The age of kings was dead, the age of the emperor had begun. Of course, there's a contradiction at the heart of all this. By declaring himself the first emperor and setting up a dynasty for 10,000 generations, Yingzheng made himself the foundation stone of a new order. But foundations are heavy, and they crack under pressure. The sheer centralization he created, the total reliance on the emperor's authority, meant that when Qin faltered after his death, the whole edifice would collapse with startling speed. In other words, in breaking with the old order, he created both a legacy and a trap. Still, in that moment of triumph, those cracks weren't visible. What mattered was that the world had been remade. The boy who had grown up under suspicion, the teenager who had outmaneuvered his regent, the king who had crushed rival states, now stood alone, cloaked in a title no one before him had dared claim. Yingzheng was no longer just a man, no longer just a king. He was Shi Huangdi, the first emperor. When people think of emperors, they usually imagine the big gestures, armies marching, palaces rising, monuments scraping the sky. And Qin Shi Huang certainly gave the world plenty of that. But some of his most enduring achievements weren't forged in battle or carved into stone. They were made in the quieter, subtler realm of systems, those everyday details that decide how societies function. It's one thing to conquer a territory. It's another to make it governable. And Qin understood that without uniformity, his empire would never hold. Picture the newly unified empire in 221 BC. On paper, it belonged to the first emperor. But in reality, it was a patchwork quilt stitched together from 7 rival states, each with its own quirks. Currencies were different. A pound in one place wasn't a pound in another. Written characters varied so wildly that officials from different regions sometimes couldn't even read one another's documents. Tax systems clashed, trade was a headache, and weights and measures were so inconsistent that a merchant's balance in Qi might look laughable in Chu. If Qin's new empire was a body, it was one riddled with mismatched limbs. The first emperor wasn't going to tolerate that. He had spent years smashing kingdoms into submission, and now he would hammer their systems into uniformity. The logic was simple. An empire this vast couldn't survive if every region played by its own rules. If Qin was to last for 10,000 generations, then every grain of rice, every coin, every written word had to line up neatly under one system. So the standardization began. Weights and measures. Qin officials rolled out a universal system of measurement. Lengths were to be measured with identical rods, volumes with the same containers, weights with the same stones. Inspectors were dispatched to ensure compliance, and severe punishments awaited anyone caught tampering. Farmers now knew exactly how much grain they owed in tax, no matter where they lived. Merchants could trade without endless arguments over scales. The economy, once fractured by regional inconsistencies, began to hum with smoother exchanges. It might not sound dramatic, but in a world where most people lived by the harvest, having reliable measures was revolutionary. Currency. Next came money. Before Qin, coins varied not only in weight but in shape: knife-shaped coins, spade-shaped coins, round coins, you name it. Each state minted its own, and carrying the wrong one across a border could render your wealth useless. Qin put an end to that chaos. The new currency was a round bronze coin with a square hole in the center, symbolizing heaven, round, and earth, square. These coins weren't just practical, they were symbolic, embedding the empire's cosmology into every transaction. For the first time, a farmer in the Yangtze Basin and a trader on the northern frontier used the same money. The empire had a shared economic language, jingling in pockets across thousands of miles. Language. Perhaps the most profound reform was script standardization. The Qin adopted what became known as small seal script, a uniform set of written characters that officials, merchants, and scholars across the empire were required to use. This wasn't just bureaucratic tidiness, it was cultural unification. Imagine living in a land where your neighbor's writing looks like an alien code, even though you speak roughly the same language. By imposing a single script, Qin ensured that decrees from the capital could be read in every province, that contracts could be written and enforced without confusion, that culture itself could flow more freely. Of all Qin's standardizations, this one cast the longest shadow. The script would evolve, yes, but the idea of a common written language became one of China's greatest strengths, a glue holding together vast diversity. Axle widths, and then there's the detail that often makes people chuckle. Qin standardized the width of cart axles. Why? Because differing axle widths meant rutted roads that only worked for local carts. With a single standard, roads became interchangeable highways, and Qin's massive road-building program suddenly had empire-wide efficiency. Troops could march, goods could move, and the empire's arteries flowed freely. It sounds trivial, but in practice it was genius. All of this was legalism in action, not lofty ideals, not moral persuasion, but pragmatic control. The first emperor and his ministers weren't dreaming about harmony. They were engineering it, piece by piece, through systems so precise that disobedience was both difficult and pointless. And it worked. For the ordinary person, life became more predictable. A measure of grain meant the same in every market. A coin was worth the same in every province. A written word carried the same meaning no matter where you traveled. For the first time, the patchwork began to feel like a single fabric. Of course, not everyone celebrated. Standardization also meant erasure. Local customs, old scripts, and regional quirks were bulldozed in the name of uniformity. For scholars steeped in their own traditions, Qin's reforms felt like cultural violence. For nobles who had once minted their own coins or imposed their own weights, it was humiliation. Standardization was both practical and political, a reminder that the first emperor's word overrode centuries of local autonomy. The empire wasn't a coalition, it was a command. And yet, the brilliance of this system can't be denied. Consider how many empires collapsed under the weight of diversity, undone by regions too different to manage, by communication too messy to enforce order. Qin's standardizations built a foundation others could only envy. Later dynasties would soften Qin's brutality, but they never abandoned its systems. Even today, the idea of China as a single cultural and political entity owes much to the first emperor's insistence on uniformity. Think of it this way. Monuments like the Terracotta Army or the Great Wall dazzle with their scale, but the real monuments to Qin's vision weren't carved from clay or stone, they were etched into daily life. Every time a farmer weighed his grain, every time a merchant counted his coins, every time an official read a decree, he was touching the invisible architecture of the Qin Empire. That's how Qin made unification real, not just through conquest, but through standardization so thorough it reached into every household. It's tempting to see this as a triumph of bureaucracy, a clever bit of statecraft, and it was. But it was also part of the emperor's deeper vision. He didn't just want to unify land. He wanted to unify time, culture, thought. By breaking with the old order and imposing his own, he was declaring that the past was over. The Qin Empire wasn't the sum of its conquered states. It was something new, and it bore his stamp in every measurement, every coin, every written character. So while soldiers rested from war and farmers returned to their fields, the true revolution was unfolding in the ordinary. A scale that read the same in east and west. A coin that fit in any palm. A road where any cart could travel. A script that every scribe could read. These were the quiet victories of Qin Shi Huang, the victories that lasted long after his dynasty fell. If standardizing coins and characters made people feel united, then roads and canals made them live united. For centuries, each kingdom had built its own networks, narrow roads for local use, canals dug here and there to serve regional trade or irrigation. Useful, yes, but fractured. You could travel within a state, but crossing borders was a different story entirely. Roads didn't connect, canals ended abruptly, measures differed. Moving goods, armies, or messages across multiple kingdoms was like threading a needle through torn cloth. The empire was stitched, but the seams kept coming apart. The first emperor wasn't content with seams. He wanted arteries. So, once the conquests were done, Qin engineers turned their eyes to the land itself. Their task was audacious: take a patchwork of states and carve into it a circulation system that would feed, protect, and control a vast, sprawling empire. This wasn't just logistics, it was ideology in action. If the empire was one body, then roads and canals would be its lifeblood, carrying soldiers, grain, decrees, and culture from the heart at Xianying out to the furthest toes of the realm. Roads. Qin's road system was legendary. Imagine wide, straight highways radiating outward from the capital like the spokes of a wheel. These weren't dirt paths for farmers' carts. They were engineered with stone, gravel, and packed earth, designed to last, designed for speed. Some sources suggest the main roads were wide enough for 6 horse-drawn chariots to ride side by side, grand avenues stretching across mountains and valleys. The empire built thousands of miles of these highways, linking the old capitals of conquered states to the new imperial core. For the military, the advantage was immediate. Qin armies could march faster than any rivals before them, responding to rebellions or invasions with terrifying speed. But it wasn't just soldiers who benefited. Merchants moved goods more efficiently, tax collectors reached villages more reliably, and messengers carried imperial decrees in days rather than weeks. Roads stitched the empire's geography into a single fabric, where distance was no longer an excuse for disobedience. Canals. Water was just as important. Qin engineers dug massive canals that redirected rivers, irrigated fields, and opened new trade routes. The Zhonghua Canal, one of the greatest engineering feats of the age, turned previously arid land near the capital into fertile farmland, feeding the heart of the empire with abundance. Imagine it, a single canal system boosting harvests so dramatically that it could support both a swelling population and the immense demands of Qin's military machine. Other canals connected rivers, creating water highways for transporting grain and goods. For an empire that demanded enormous amounts of labor, grain wasn't just food, it was fuel. Grain kept soldiers marching, workers digging, and peasants farming without collapsing from hunger. Controlling water meant controlling life itself, and the Qin knew it. Symbolism and surveillance. Roads and canals weren't just practical, they were political. Every new highway was a visible reminder that the empire's reach extended everywhere. A farmer traveling down a Qin road wasn't just moving through the countryside, he was walking a line drawn by the emperor himself. Every cart that fit neatly into the ruts of standardized axles, every canal that redirected rivers to serve the state, whispered the same truth: Qin was in control. And with control came surveillance. Those wide, straight roads weren't easy to hide along. Movement became more visible, easier to track. Soldiers stationed along highways kept watch, and rebels had fewer places to disappear into. Canals redirected not just water, but populations. Whole villages relocated to work fields or construction sites tied to Qin's vision. The empire didn't just bind people together, it bound them tighter under the emperor's gaze. Daily life. For ordinary people, these projects were a mixed blessing. On the one hand, better roads and canals meant food reached markets more efficiently, travel became easier, and famine could sometimes be alleviated by moving grain from one region to another. On the other hand, the cost of building them was staggering, and that cost was paid in sweat and blood. Hundreds of thousands of laborers were conscripted, working under brutal conditions, often far from home. Many died digging canals or hauling stones for roads that stretched across unforgiving terrain. For the peasants, Qin's infrastructure was both lifeline and burden, a marvel that improved life, but also a chain that bound them to endless toil. Legacy. It's impossible to overstate how transformative this network was. Later dynasties inherited the bones of Qin's system, expanding and repairing it for centuries. The Han, the Tang, the Ming all relied on road and canal networks that traced their origins back to Qin's vision. Even today, parts of the Zhonghua Canal still exist, a testament to the durability of Qin engineering. And here's the poetic irony. While Qin Shi Huang is remembered for the grandeur of his tomb and the terracotta army, the empire's true immortality came through projects like these. Clay statues crumble, palaces burn, but roads and canals, systems that reshape daily life, can outlast dynasties. Qin's roads carried not just soldiers but culture. His canals carried not just water but unity. You know what's striking? The way Qin's infrastructure mirrors his philosophy. Just as legalism imposed uniformity through law, roads imposed uniformity on geography. Just as standardized coins and measures made people's lives predictable, canals made the flow of food and resources predictable. Every ditch dug, every stone laid, was another line of control. So, by the end of his reign, Qin Shi Huang wasn't just ruling an empire on paper. He was ruling a body pulsing with arteries he had carved into the land itself. His power wasn't only in decrees and soldiers. It was in the very roads people walked, the very water they drank. His empire didn't just conquer people, it reorganized their world from the ground up. Long before archaeologists stumbled upon it in 1974, buried beneath a farmer's field near Xi'an, the terracotta army had been waiting in silence for over 2,000 years. Row after row of clay soldiers, life-sized, each one different, each one armed, all standing guard in eternal formation. It's one of those discoveries so staggering it almost feels like a myth, an emperor's fantasy frozen in earth. But to understand why Qin Shi Huang commanded its creation, we need to step inside his mind, into his vision of life, death, and what it meant to rule forever. Qin Shi Huang was obsessed with permanence. He had conquered states, standardized language, money, and measurement, and built roads and canals to knit the empire together. But all of that, for all its grandeur, was fragile. Palaces could burn. Roads could crumble. Empires could fall. The only way to truly last was to outlast death itself. And in the ancient Chinese worldview, death wasn't the end, it was a continuation, a mirror of life above. Just as emperors ruled with armies in this world, so too would they need armies in the next. So sometime during his reign, probably even before he took the title of first emperor, the massive project began. Tens of thousands of laborers, craftsmen, and artists were conscripted to shape an army out of clay. Not a symbolic handful of figures, not crude idols, but a full-scale, lifelike army, complete with infantry, archers, cavalry, and charioteers. They stood in formation, facing east, the direction of conquered lands, ready to march with their emperor into eternity. What's breathtaking about the terracotta army isn't just the scale. Estimates suggest more than 8,000 soldiers, 670 horses, and 130 chariots, but the individuality. No two faces are alike. Each soldier has distinct features, some broad-cheeked, some lean, some stern, some calm. Hairstyles differ, expressions vary, postures change. It's as if the artisans were commanded not to produce an army of statues, but to recreate an army of men. The emperor wasn't content with clay soldiers. He wanted people, or at least the illusion of them, standing guard forever. And it didn't stop with soldiers. Acrobats, musicians, and officials were also sculpted, along with stables, weapons, and armor. The underground necropolis mirrored the empire above. Rivers of mercury were said to flow through the tomb, simulating real waterways, and palaces rose in miniature. The first emperor was building not just a tomb but an entire afterlife empire, one that would reflect his earthly rule in uncanny detail. But here's the chilling part. This project wasn't just an artistic marvel, it was also a human cost of staggering magnitude. The laborers who built it were often convicts, prisoners of war, or conscripted peasants. Conditions were brutal, deaths frequent. Some accounts suggest workers who knew too much about the tomb's secrets were executed or buried alive to keep the emperor's vision hidden. The terracotta army, for all its silent beauty today, was born in an atmosphere of fear, sweat, and death. It's worth pausing to consider the psychology behind it. For all his power, Qin Shi Huang was terrified of mortality. He ruled as if he could bend even death to his will. The terracotta army wasn't just a monument, it was a defiance, a clay shout against the inevitability of decay. He had unified China, reshaped its systems, and imposed his laws. Why should death be any different? If he could command armies in life, he would command them in death. If he could rule one world, why not two? And yet, there's irony here. For all his obsession with control, the emperor couldn't control how history would unfold. His dynasty would crumble just a few years after his death, his palaces would burn, his decrees would fade. But the clay soldiers endured, buried and forgotten until modern times. The empire he sought to make eternal collapsed, but the army he built for the next world stood silently through millennia. In a way, the terracotta army outlasted the Qin Dynasty itself. What strikes you when you stand before them today is the humanity in their faces. Each soldier seems alive, caught in a moment of waiting. You almost expect them to shift, to glance sideways, to breathe. They remind us that history isn't just kings and decrees, it's people. Craftsmen shaping clay, soldiers modeled after real men, peasants laboring under orders. The emperor's dream of eternity was built on the backs of countless lives, and their fingerprints are literally baked into the clay. The terracotta army also speaks to a broader truth about Qin Shi Huang. He was a man of extremes, practical to the point of cruelty, visionary to the point of madness. He could standardize weights and measures with cold efficiency, but he could also dream of rivers of mercury flowing through his tomb. He could be both the hard-nosed politician who unified China and the frightened mortal who thought clay soldiers could shield him from death. That contradiction, brilliance and paranoia, control and fear, is what makes him such a fascinating figure. And perhaps that's the ultimate legacy of the terracotta army. It isn't just an archaeological wonder. It's a mirror of the emperor's mind, disciplined, detailed, ambitious, but haunted by insecurity. The soldiers don't just guard his tomb, they embody the paradox of his reign. He wanted eternity, but he built it out of clay. He wanted immortality, but he buried it underground. He wanted control, but he left behind silence. Today, millions of visitors walk through the pits, gazing at the rows of clay men, awestruck. The emperor is long gone. His dynasty is a memory. But his clay soldiers remain, standing at attention, their faces carrying the weight of his impossible dream. In their stillness, they whisper the story of a man who conquered death in the only way he could, by leaving behind a monument so strange and so vast that we're still talking about it 2,000 years later. When we talk about walls, the mind jumps immediately to the Great Wall of China, stretching over mountains and deserts like the spine of a sleeping dragon. But in Qin Shi Huang's day, there wasn't one continuous wall. There were many. Each of the old warring states had built defensive ramparts to keep out enemies, especially the nomadic tribes of the north, the Xiongnu, fierce horsemen who raided and vanished as quickly as they appeared. These walls were scattered, uneven, and often crumbling. Useful for a local king, but not nearly enough for an emperor who claimed to rule, all under heaven. For the first emperor, unification wasn't just about taming rival states within. It was also about defending borders without. The wars that had consumed the warring states were over, but threats still pressed at the edges. To the north, the Xiongnu rode their fast horses across the steppe, slipping through gaps to raid farms and villages. To the south, new territories in Chu and beyond still simmered with unrest. Qin's empire, though vast, was fragile at the edges. And edges, in the emperor's mind, needed to be bound. So the order went out: connect the old walls, repair them, extend them, and build new ones where gaps yawned. The result wasn't the Great Wall as we know it today, but the earliest skeleton of it, a patchwork of ramparts running for thousands of miles across the north. This was the Qin wall system, and its construction was as brutal as it was grand. The method was simple but effective: tamped earth. Workers piled layer upon layer of packed soil, beaten hard with wooden tools until it became dense and solid, almost like stone. Stone itself was used where available, but earth was abundant, and earth could be molded to the emperor's vision. The walls rose across mountains, valleys, and plains, punctuated with watchtowers where soldiers stood guard. Fires could be lit to send signals along the line, warning of raids. For the first time, China's northern frontier began to take on the shape of a continuous defense. But here's the human cost: it was staggering. Tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, of conscripted laborers were forced into service. Peasants, soldiers, prisoners, all dragged into the northern wilderness to work under grueling conditions. They dug, lifted, tamped, and carried in scorching summers and freezing winters. Many never returned. Starvation, exhaustion, disease, and accidents claimed countless lives. The wall consumed them as mercilessly as it consumed stone and earth. Later generations would speak of the wall as the longest cemetery in the world, its foundation built on bones as much as on soil. It's almost impossible not to think about the irony here. The wall was meant to protect the people of the empire, yet it devoured those very people in its making. Villages lost fathers, sons, and brothers to the emperor's vision. Families watched loved ones march away to the wall and never come back. For them, the wall wasn't a symbol of security, it was a reminder of loss. And yet, as harsh as it was, the wall worked at least for a time. It slowed raids, pushed nomads back, and asserted Qin's dominance over its frontier. More importantly, it was a statement. The wall wasn't just military, it was psychological. It told both subjects and enemies, this land has limits, and those limits are ours. A farmer living deep in the empire might never see the wall, but he knew it was out there, stretching beyond the horizon, defining his world. The emperor's reach wasn't just felt in taxes or laws, it was etched into the earth itself. Think of the symbolism. Roads connected the empire inward, stitching provinces to the capital. The wall defined the empire outward, carving a line between inside and outside, civilization and barbarism, order and chaos. The first emperor didn't just rule people, he ruled space. Every mile of road and wall was a declaration of that control. Of course, history loves to remind us that even the grandest walls can't solve everything. The Xiongnu weren't defeated forever. They learned to ride around, to exploit weak points, to strike where garrisons were thin. The wall slowed them, but it didn't erase them. Later dynasties would pour even more labor, stone, and blood into rebuilding and extending it, until it became the colossal Great Wall we know today. Qin's contribution was just the beginning, but without that beginning, the later expansions would never have taken shape. What makes this moment so powerful in the Qin story is how clearly it reflects the emperor's mind. He wasn't content with half measures. Where earlier kings built walls for themselves, he built walls for an empire. Where they patched holes, he envisioned continuity. Where they saw defense, he saw identity. For Qin Shi Huang, the wall was more than a barrier, it was a metaphor for his reign. Strong, unyielding, stretching beyond sight, demanding endless sacrifice, yet undeniably shaping the land. And here's the paradox again. The emperor sought immortality through monuments like the wall. And in a way, he succeeded. Even though the Qin dynasty itself collapsed after just 15 years, the image of the first emperor's walls became part of China's collective memory, absorbed into the myth of the Great Wall. People forgot the details of his decrees, but they remembered the wall and the suffering it cost. His empire died young, but his vision remained standing on ridges and plains. So when we look at the Great Wall today, we're not just looking at Ming Dynasty bricks or tourist panoramas. We're looking at the ghost of Qin's first attempt to bind a frontier, to draw a line across the earth as if to say, "This is ours. Beyond lies the other. Here begins China." And whether admired or mourned, it's impossible not to hear in those stones the echo of the first emperor's will, unyielding, monumental, and merciless. By the time the first emperor had declared himself Shi Huangdi, unified the land, and begun stitching it together with roads, canals, and walls, one thing was clear: ruling China wasn't going to be about gentle persuasion. It was going to be about control. And for Qin, control meant fear. Remember Shang Yang's reforms? They had already planted the legalist idea that people couldn't be trusted to act virtuously on their own. Instead, they had to be guided, prodded, punished, and rewarded like cattle. Qin Shi Huang didn't just inherit this philosophy, he expanded it until it became the very atmosphere of his empire. Law wasn't just a tool. Law was everything. And the law was harsh. In the Qin Code, there were no minor crimes. Every offense carried weight, and the punishments were brutal. A farmer who failed to meet his grain quota could be flogged, fined, or stripped of land. A soldier who faltered in battle might face execution. Even small infractions, like failing to report your neighbor's disobedience, could drag down an entire household. Laws weren't simply about individual guilt, they spread like ink on paper, staining families, neighbors, and villages. This system of collective responsibility turned everyone into both suspect and enforcer. If your cousin broke the law, you were expected to report him. If your neighbor whispered dissent, silence made you complicit. In a way, Qin invented a proto-surveillance state, not with cameras or wiretaps, but with fear woven into social bonds. You didn't just fear the emperor's officials, you feared your own relatives, your own friends. Trust was poisoned, and suspicion became the default. It's not hard to imagine the daily tension. A farmer coming home from the fields, worried about whether his harvest would meet the quota. A wife fretting that her husband's grumble about taxes might be overheard. A scholar hiding his old bamboo scrolls for fear that owning the wrong text might mean punishment. Ordinary life under Qin was lived under constant watch, even when no official was nearby. Fear had seeped into the walls of every home. And the punishments, well, they were designed to be terrifying. Branding, mutilation, hard labor, execution. These weren't just about removing offenders, they were about sending a message. If one man suffered, 10 others learned to obey. It's cruel, but in Qin's logic, cruelty wasn't a flaw. It was efficiency. A society ruled by fear wasted less time debating morality and more time obeying. But here's the contradiction: harshness did bring order. Roads were safe. Markets functioned. Tax revenue flowed steadily into the capital. The empire's bureaucracy, no longer clogged by noble privileges or local customs, ran with a cold, mechanical precision. For peasants who had lived through decades of war, there was, ironically, a kind of stability in Qin's terror. You might fear the law, but at least you knew what the law was. Predictability has its appeal, even when it comes with lashes and chains. Still, that stability was fragile. The problem with ruling through fear is that fear doesn't inspire loyalty, it breeds resentment. People complied because they had to, not because they believed in Qin's greatness. Every tax, every conscription order, every punishment was another weight pressing down on the population. And like any system held together by pressure, cracks would eventually form. What makes Qin's surveillance system especially fascinating is how modern it feels. Replace bamboo slips with databases, village spies with digital tracking, and the logic is eerily familiar: control through omnipresence. The idea that nothing escapes the gaze of the state. The difference, of course, is that Qin's methods were more visceral, blood and pain rather than silent observation. But the principle was the same: obedience through visibility, visibility through fear. There's another layer here, too. Qin's system didn't just punish disobedience, it punished individuality. Anything that smacked of independent thought, Independent culture or independent loyalty was a threat. That's why scholars would later be targeted in the infamous book burnings, why nobles were stripped of their titles, why local customs were erased in favor of standardized ones. The emperor wanted a world where only one identity mattered, subject of Qin. All else was dangerous excess. And for a while, it worked. The empire was remarkably stable for something so new. No rival kings rose from within. No foreign power managed to shatter its defenses. The machine kept humming, powered by laws that left no room for ambiguity. If Qin Shi Huang walked through one of his cities, he would have seen order, markets neatly organized, soldiers standing in formation, officials recording quotas, families quietly working. To him, this would have looked like success. But beneath that surface order, resentment was smoldering. The very fear that made people obey also made them dream of escape. Families who lost sons to forced labor muttered curses in secret. Farmers exhausted by quotas fantasized about rebellion. Scholars whose texts had been destroyed carried bitterness like hidden fire. The Qin system was efficient, yes, but it was brittle. Push it too far and it would snap. In the moment, though, Qin Shi Huang believed he had found the secret to eternal stability. He had roads, walls, soldiers, coins, and a script that united his people. And with harsh laws and surveillance, he had control. To him, this was the perfect formula: power that could not be challenged, order that could not be broken. Fear, in his hands, was not cruelty, it was the glue of empire. The irony, of course, is that glue made of fear dries hard but cracks easily. The more rigid the structure, the less it can bend, and when pressure builds, it doesn't adapt, it shatters. Qin Shi Huang didn't live to see it, but his system, as flawless as it seemed, carried the seeds of its own collapse. An emperor may sit at the center of the storm, but he never rules alone. No matter how absolute Qin Shi Huang's power seemed, the empire was too vast for one man's eyes and hands to manage. Behind the throne moved an army of administrators, scribes, advisors, and, most controversially, eunuchs. These figures, often overlooked in the grand sweep of history, were the gears and pulleys that made Qin's massive machine run. Let's start with the eunuchs, because they're often the most misunderstood. In many dynasties, eunuchs became infamous for corruption, palace intrigue, and manipulation. But in Qin's time, their role was still taking shape. Why eunuchs at all? The logic was cold but simple: men without families of their own were considered safer. A eunuch couldn't build a rival clan, couldn't pass power to sons, couldn't easily betray the throne in favor of private ambition. In theory, their loyalty was pure, directed solely toward the emperor. And Qin Shi Huang, ever suspicious of divided loyalties, found them useful. Inside the palace, eunuchs managed daily operations, guarded the harem, and acted as intermediaries between the emperor and the outside world. They were close, sometimes dangerously close, to the seat of power. Proximity mattered in Qin's system. Access to the emperor meant influence, and eunuchs controlled access. If you wanted your petition read, your case heard, your proposal considered, chances are you had to go through a eunuch first. It was a subtle form of power, but in a centralized empire, subtlety often mattered more than brute force. Then there were the scholars and scribes, and here the story turns complicated. Qin was not a dynasty that celebrated intellectual freedom. In fact, it feared it. Legalism distrusted Confucian moralists and Taoist dreamers, seeing them as threats to order. Yet, the empire still relied on scholars, men trained in reading, writing, and record-keeping, to administer its sprawling bureaucracy. These weren't philosophers holding forth in debates. They were clerks with brushes, filling bamboo slips with tallies of grain, lists of laborers, military rosters, tax receipts, and decrees. Their ink was the lifeblood of the state. And some scholars did hold policy roles, particularly those who embraced legalist thought. Men like Li Si, one of Qin's most important ministers, weren't just bureaucrats, they were architects of the empire's ideology. Li Si was a legalist zealot who believed diversity of thought was chaos and that unity required control, even over ideas. He was the driving force behind many of Qin's harshest policies, including the infamous book burnings. To him, Confucian teachings about virtue and morality were dangerous distractions. The state didn't need virtue, it needed obedience. His influence over the emperor was immense, and through him, legalism hardened from philosophy into daily practice. Then we have the officials, the provincial governors, magistrates, and administrators scattered across the empire. Under the old feudal system, nobles had held these positions, ruling their lands like little kings. Qin shattered that tradition. Nobles were stripped of their power, relocated to the capital, and replaced with officials appointed directly by the emperor. These officials had no local ties, no hereditary rights. Their authority came from Qin Shi Huang alone, and their survival depended on serving him well. It was a masterstroke of centralization. By breaking the power of nobles, Qin eliminated rival centers of authority. But it also created a new class of men whose loyalty was razor-thin. They served because they were watched, rewarded, and punished according to performance. Fail to deliver tax quotas, fail to enforce laws, fail to suppress dissent, and you could be demoted, disgraced, or worse. Success wasn't always safer either. Too much competence could breed suspicion in a ruler as paranoid as Qin Shi Huang. Officials walked a knife's edge, balancing efficiency with humility, power with deference. Together, eunuchs, scholars, and officials formed a kind of nervous system for the empire. The eunuchs controlled access to the throne. The scholars produced the records that made governance possible. The officials carried the emperor's will into the provinces. Each group had its strengths, each its weaknesses, and all were bound by the same thing: fear. Fear of failing the emperor. Fear of punishment. Fear of each other. And yet, for all the paranoia, the system worked, at least while the first emperor lived. Messages flowed from Xianyang to distant provinces with astonishing speed. Laws were enforced consistently, taxes collected, rebellions suppressed. The empire's sheer size demanded this level of organization, and Qin's administrative machine delivered. But beneath the surface, the seeds of future disaster were sown. Eunuchs grew bolder, whispering in the emperor's ear. Scholars simmered with resentment over censorship. Officials resented their precarious positions, dreaming of a world where loyalty to local roots might matter again. You could say Qin built a bureaucracy as disciplined as its army. But just as soldiers can mutiny, officials can betray, eunuchs can conspire, and scholars can rebel in spirit if not in arms. The Qin dynasty's fall would come, in part, from the very apparatus it relied upon. Still, in Qin Shi Huang's lifetime, this apparatus gave him something no king before him had ever achieved: direct, unchallenged authority over an empire stretching thousands of miles. And here's the human truth behind the policy: no emperor, no matter how powerful, rules alone. Qin Shi Huang may have believed himself eternal, untouchable, more than human, but his empire depended on ordinary men with brushes, seals, and whispered words. The eunuchs guarding his chambers, the scholars tallying grain, the officials enforcing quotas, these were the hands that held up his throne. Without them, even the first emperor would have been just another dreamer in a chaotic world. By the time the empire was unified, Qin Shi Huang had standardized almost everything that could be touched: coins, weights, roads, canals, axles, and even writing. But there was something he couldn't standardize with laws and measurements: thought. Ideas had a way of slipping past walls, of hiding in bamboo scrolls, of being whispered in the corners of markets and homes. And in an empire built on uniformity, independent thought was dangerous. The trigger came from a question that sounds almost harmless: how should the empire be remembered? The first emperor was obsessed with legacy. He wanted his dynasty to last for 10,000 generations. But scholars in his court, especially those steeped in Confucian traditions, weren't always so flattering. They compared Qin unfavorably to the old Zhou dynasty, whose kings were remembered as moral rulers chosen by heaven's mandate. They whispered that Qin's harsh laws lacked virtue, that its punishments dishonored humanity, that its obsession with order crushed the spirit of the people. For Qin Shi Huang, these weren't academic debates. They were threats. Words could undermine loyalty, could plant seeds of doubt, could weaken the ideological foundation of his new empire. And when he asked his ministers how to respond, his most trusted advisor, Li Si, offered a chilling solution: if ideas are dangerous, destroy them. So, in 213 BCE, the emperor issued an edict that shook the cultural heart of China: burn the books. Not every book, but most. Histories of the other states? Gone. Records that compared past dynasties to Qin? Gone. Philosophical texts that preached morality, virtue, or alternate visions of society? Gone. Only works on agriculture, medicine, divination, and legalist doctrine were spared, practical knowledge that served the state. The past was to be erased, the present purified, the future molded to Qin's will. Think about that for a moment. Centuries of thought, Confucian classics, songs, stories, genealogies reduced to ash. Imagine being a scholar who had spent his life memorizing the Book of Songs or the Analects, only to watch scrolls burned in the streets, libraries emptied, words lost forever. It wasn't just censorship, it was cultural annihilation. To the emperor, it was unity. To the scholars, it was a funeral for memory itself. But the destruction didn't stop at books. Words lived in people, too, and people could resist even when their scrolls were gone. According to later accounts, hundreds of scholars who defied the edict or who criticized Qin's policies were rounded up. Some were buried alive, others executed. The phrase burning of books and burying of scholars entered history as a symbol of Qin's cruelty, a shorthand for the silencing of voices through fire and blood. Historians debate the details. Was it truly hundreds buried, or is the number exaggerated by later dynasties eager to vilify Qin? But whether literal or symbolic, the meaning was clear. Dissent wasn't just unwelcome, it was deadly. To oppose the emperor's vision was to risk not only your life, but the obliteration of your entire intellectual tradition. Here's the paradox: Qin's obsession with erasing the past may have ensured he was remembered. The very act of burning books etched him into history as a tyrant. Later Confucian historians, writing under the Han, painted Qin as the ultimate villain, an emperor so afraid of ideas that he tried to erase them. In trying to silence his critics, Qin Shi Huang guaranteed that their voices would echo louder across time, casting him as the dark foil to Confucian virtue. But in the moment, the policy worked. For a few years, dissent went underground. The only texts widely available were those approved by the state. The empire spoke with one voice, wrote with one script, obeyed one law. It was unity by subtraction, coherence through destruction. And yet, unity built on ash is brittle. Books burned can sometimes be recopied from memory. Ideas buried can sometimes sprout again, carried by those who remember. Fire can consume scrolls, but it cannot consume thought entirely. Qin Shi Huang, for all his power, couldn't control memory forever. Still, the fear was real. Imagine a young scholar in those years, clutching fragments of an old Confucian text, debating whether to risk hiding it in a wall, burying it in a jar, or surrendering it to the flames. Imagine the silence in academies once filled with debate, the unease in families who had once recited poetry together now glancing over their shoulders before speaking. The burning of books wasn't just about texts, it was about choking the air of intellectual life. The tragedy is that Qin Shi Huang's desire for intellectual control reflected the same logic that had brought him success. Standardization of coins, measures, and script worked. Why not standardization of thought? But unlike coins or measures, ideas resist conformity. You can hammer them down for a time, but they slip through cracks, hide in whispers, and resurface in unexpected places. Qin treated culture like currency, something to be minted and controlled. In doing so, he revealed both his brilliance and his blindness. So, in the annals of Chinese history, this moment stands as one of the starkest examples of how far Qin Shi Huang was willing to go for unity. He unified roads, walls, language, and law. But when he tried to unify minds, he crossed into the realm of tyranny so harsh that, even centuries later, his name was cursed by scholars who survived him. The first emperor dreamed of eternal order. Instead, he became a symbol of how fragile order can be when it's enforced with fire and fear. When Qin Shi Huang unified China in 221 BCE, he might have stopped there. After all, he had done what no king before him had managed. He had ended centuries of chaos and brought all the warring states under one rule. It was a staggering achievement in itself. But for the first emperor, unification wasn't enough. Borders were not walls, they were invitations. To the north, nomadic horsemen still prowled the steppes, testing the edges of the empire. To the south lay fertile lands and strange new peoples, rich in resources but stubborn in resistance. Qin Shi Huang wanted not just China, as it had been known, but an empire that stretched further than anyone had imagined. The north, fighting the Xiongnu were Qin's greatest external headache. They were not farmers tied to land, but nomadic warriors tied to the horse. Their speed, mobility, and hit-and-run raids made them infuriating enemies for a state built on heavy infantry and rigid formations. Qin armies could conquer fortified cities, but how do you conquer horsemen who refuse to stand still? The emperor's answer was twofold: force and fortification. He dispatched armies northward, driving deep into the steppes, trying to break Xiongnu power through sheer weight of numbers. For a while, it seemed to work. Qin campaigns pushed them back, establishing garrisons and marking the frontier with new walls. These weren't just defenses, they were statements telling the Xiongnu, this is as far as you ride. But the truth was murkier. The steppe was vast, and Qin's soldiers were far from home. For every raid suppressed, another would slip through elsewhere. The walls slowed the Xiongnu, but they didn't defeat them. Still, Qin's northern campaigns set a precedent. Later dynasties, the Han most famously, would wrestle with the same problem for centuries: how to fight an enemy who lived beyond the plow, beyond the city, beyond the empire's reach. Qin's answer was to push hard, build walls, and project strength even when the frontier remained restless. The south, expanding into Chu and Yu. If the north was about holding back raiders, the south was about pulling new lands into the empire's orbit. Beyond the Yangtze River lay regions rich in forests, fertile plains, and exotic goods. But these lands were not empty. They were home to the peoples of Chu, remnants of the old state, and the Baihui tribes, groups with their own languages, customs, and fierce resistance to outside control. For Qin Shi Huang, southern expansion was both strategic and symbolic. Strategically, controlling the south meant more farmland, more resources, and access to river routes that could feed the empire's hungry heart. Symbolically, it meant finishing what conquest had started: no loose ends, no pockets of independence left to challenge the emperor's claim of ruling all under heaven. So Qin armies marched south. Campaigns were brutal, cutting through forests and rivers, forcing local tribes into submission. Fortresses rose along the Yangtze and beyond, securing new territories. Colonists were sent to settle the conquered lands, spreading Qin's language, laws, and systems into regions that had never known them. The Baihui resisted fiercely, retreating into jungles and mountains, but Qin's relentless machine pushed forward. It wasn't easy. The south was humid, disease-ridden, and unfamiliar to soldiers from the north. Campaigns dragged on, costing lives and treasure. But slowly, the empire's southern frontier expanded, laying the foundations for what would later become important centers of Chinese civilization. Regions that had once been considered wild or peripheral were pulled into the gravitational field of Qin's authority. The logic of expansion: why expand at all? Some might say Qin Shi Huang was simply greedy for more land. But his logic was rooted in legalist thinking: strength comes from growth, and stagnation invites rebellion. By keeping the army busy, by pouring resources into new conquests, the emperor ensured that soldiers stayed loyal and officials stayed focused. Expansion was both practical and psychological. It gave the empire momentum, the sense of a mission still unfolding. And yet, like everything Qin built, it came at a cost. Soldiers conscripted for northern and southern campaigns left their fields untended. Families waited years for sons who never came home. Resources strained under the weight of endless warfare, even after unification had supposedly brought peace. The empire's subjects might have wondered, wasn't the point of unity to end war? Why then did war never seem to end? The shadow of overreach, the northern walls stretched the empire's defenses thin. The southern campaigns drained manpower. And while victories piled up, so did resentment. To the emperor, expansion meant security and glory. To the people, it often meant exhaustion. This tension between the emperor's vision and his people's endurance was one of the quiet cracks forming in Qin's mighty facade. But in Qin Shi Huang's lifetime, the cracks were invisible. He saw only the victories, the banners planted on new frontiers, the maps expanding with every campaign. To him, this was destiny. He wasn't just ruling the world as he knew it, he was redefining the boundaries of the world itself. The legacy of Qin's wars later generations would inherit both the successes and the problems of these expansions. The North would remain a constant frontier battle, shaping Chinese history for centuries. The South, though fiercely resistant, would eventually become integral to the empire's heart, its lands among the most fertile and productive in all China. Qin's wars didn't just add territory, they reshaped the very idea of what China was. In the end, these campaigns revealed the essence of Qin Shi Huang's rule. He wasn't content to defend. He wasn't satisfied with enough. His empire was a living thing, always pushing outward, always demanding more. To him, stillness was weakness, and weakness meant collapse. Better to bleed forward than risk stagnation. And so, north and south, Qin's armies marched. They built walls in the deserts, carved paths through jungles, left behind garrisons and graves. The emperor called it unification. His subjects might have called it endless war. But in the grand sweep of history, these campaigns ensured that when we speak of China, we speak not of a narrow strip of land along the Yellow River, but of a vast civilization stretching from steppe to sea, from forest to mountain. If unification gave Qin Shi Huang his empire, it was the bodies of his people that built it. Roads, canals, palaces, tombs, and walls don't rise on ambition alone. They rise on labor, millions of hands hauling, digging, pounding, carving. And in the Qin system, labor wasn't voluntary. It was demanded, commanded, extracted like grain from the fields. For all the glory of the first emperor's vision, the foundation was suffering. Population relocations, one of Qin's most radical policies, was the mass relocation of people. The logic was pure legalism: eliminate potential threats, strip away local loyalties, and repopulate strategic areas. Nobles from conquered states were uprooted and moved to the capital, Xianyang. It wasn't an invitation, it was exile in disguise. By concentrating the old aristocracy under his eye, Qin Shi Huang stripped them of their power bases. No noble could raise an army on ancestral land if that land was now farmed by Qin loyalists. But it wasn't just nobles. Whole communities were uprooted and resettled. Farmers from the north were sent south to colonize new lands. Skilled artisans were relocated to work on imperial projects. Soldiers' families were moved to frontiers to secure them. The empire was treated like a game board, and people were pieces to be shifted at will. For those uprooted, the policy was devastating. Imagine leaving the fields your family had farmed for generations, torn from familiar soil and graves, marched to a distant province where new fields awaited, but so did hunger, disease, and resentment. Forced labor, roads, walls, palaces, and tombs. Then came the labor itself. Qin's grand projects, the walls, canals, palaces, and especially the emperor's tomb, required an almost unimaginable workforce. Millions were conscripted, often for years at a time, leaving families behind. Men dug canals until their hands blistered and bled. They hauled stones for walls under the burning sun, tamped earth in freezing winds, carved clay for armies that would never march. The conditions were brutal. Food was scarce, disease rampant, punishment swift. A man who faltered risked lashes or worse. Many never returned. Folklore and later histories would speak of bones buried under the Great Wall, of fields left barren because too many men were taken away, of families starving while their sons died building monuments for a man obsessed with eternity. It wasn't just infrastructure. Qin Shi Huang built palaces so vast they seemed to stretch forever, filling them with treasures and officials, symbols of his absolute power. And all of it was done with forced labor. To the emperor, this was proof of his might, tens of thousands moving at his command, shaping earth and stone to his will. To his people, it was a nightmare of exhaustion and grief. The human cost. What's striking is how invisible the common people were in Qin's grand vision. They weren't subjects with lives of their own, they were resources to be spent. Just as wood was cut for beams and stone quarried for walls, people were conscripted for projects. Legalist ideology saw them less as individuals and more as parts of a collective machine, their worth measured in output and obedience. But people aren't stone. They feel. They break. They resent. And every forced march, every emptied village, every exhausted death planted seeds of bitterness. Qin's monuments rose high, but so did the quiet anger of the people who built them. It was an anger that would later fuel rebellion when the dynasty faltered. Order through displacement. Yet, from Qin Shi Huang's perspective, these policies made sense. Relocation scattered potential enemies, broke old ties of loyalty, and secured new territories. Forced labor created the infrastructure that bound the empire together. In his mind, he was forging unity not just through conquest, but through the very movement and toil of his people. Roads linked provinces, canals fed fields, walls secured borders, all powered by labor. To him, this was the cost of greatness, a necessary sacrifice for eternal stability. Legacy of suffering. Later dynasties would take a lesson from Qin's mistakes. They still used conscripted labor, but many tempered it with incentives, lighter quotas, or exemptions. They saw how Qin's merciless demands had broken the dynasty from within. But even as they criticized Qin's harshness, they also inherited the fruits of it: the canals, the roads, the expanded farmlands. The people's suffering had created a foundation others would stand on for centuries. There's a haunting irony here. Qin Shi Huang built his empire with the bodies of his subjects, yet those very subjects destroyed his dynasty after his death. The same peasants who raised his walls would later tear down his palaces. The same farmers who dug his canals would rise in rebellion when the burden became unbearable. Forced labor gave him monuments, but it also gave his dynasty enemies among his own people. A glimpse of daily life. Picture a family in the Qin countryside. The father conscripted for wall building, gone for years, perhaps never returning. The mother struggling to keep the fields alive, meeting grain quotas under threat of punishment. Children hungry, pressed into small tasks, always aware that any misstep could bring punishment to the whole household. For them, the emperor wasn't a distant figure of awe. He was the reason they suffered, the shadow hanging over their every day. The emperor's blindness. And yet, Qin Shi Huang never saw himself as cruel. He saw himself as necessary. To him, greatness demanded sacrifice, and what was the suffering of a few million compared to the eternal glory of an empire united, strong, and everlasting? He believed he was building something beyond human life, something cosmic, eternal. But in reaching for eternity, he overlooked the human present, the daily toll of his demands. That's point 16 fully expanded. Population relocations, forced labor, the human cost of Qin's projects, and how these policies both strengthened and doomed the dynasty. For all his conquests, for all his walls, armies, and decrees, Qin Shi Huang could not conquer one enemy: time. He had unified China, reshaped its systems, and commanded laborers to raise monuments that touched the horizon. But in the quiet of his chambers, when the noise of court faded and the torches burned low, he faced the same fear every human faces: the certainty of death. And unlike most men, he refused to accept it. From early in his reign, Qin Shi Huang showed signs of deep paranoia. Some of it came from experience. He had grown up surrounded by palace intrigue, assassination attempts, and rivalries sharp enough to kill. The failed attempt by Jing Ke, the Yan assassin who had lunged at him with a hidden dagger, had left scars on his psyche. Ever after, he trusted few, suspected many, and believed threats lurked everywhere. Food tasters sampled his meals, guards rotated constantly, and spies reported on officials and commoners alike. He moved from palace to palace, refusing to sleep in the same chamber twice in a row, convinced that assassins shadowed him. For a man who had bent an empire to his will, he was strangely powerless against his own fears. And then came the deeper fear, not of assassins, but of mortality itself. The first emperor couldn't bear the thought that death would undo everything he had built. What good was unification if it ended with his bones? What was the point of 10,000 generations if he couldn't live to see them? He wanted eternity, not just for his dynasty, but for himself. So he sought it. Legends tell of expeditions sent in search of the elixir of life, potions and herbs that would grant immortality. Taoist alchemists promised secrets hidden on remote islands, whispered of magical beings in the eastern seas who possessed the key to eternal life. The emperor, desperate, believed them. He dispatched fleets eastward, ordering them to find the Isles of the Immortals, places like Penglai, shrouded in myth. Envoys carried gifts, soldiers protected them, and ships vanished into the horizon, never to return. Whether they perished in storms or simply settled far away, no one knows. But the emperor sent more, convinced that somewhere beyond the waves lay the secret to defeating death. Closer to home, he turned to alchemy. Scholars and alchemists concocted potions of strange herbs and minerals, claiming they could extend life. Ironically, many of these immortality elixirs contained mercury, a substance toxic enough to shorten his life rather than prolong it. Some accounts suggest that Qin Shi Huang consumed these potions regularly, poisoning himself even as he sought to live forever. The quest for immortality wasn't just superstition. It reflected the emperor's worldview. He had conquered men and mountains, forced nature to serve him through canals and walls. Why should death be different? To him, mortality was another frontier to be broken by sheer will, another problem to be solved with enough labor, discipline, and force. But death isn't a kingdom. It doesn't yield to armies. And that was the tragedy of his obsession. His paranoia deepened as he aged. Dreams and omens haunted him. Reports of strange creatures, like a sea monster said to block his expeditions, terrified him. He consulted diviners and astrologers, desperate for reassurance. Some stories claim he once ordered archers to fire upon the sea itself to drive away spirits. Whether true or embroidered by later chroniclers, the stories capture a man wrestling not with armies, but with shadows, lashing out at the intangible. Meanwhile, his obsession with death drove his greatest construction, his tomb. Even as the terracotta army was assembled, laborers dug deeper, carving chambers beneath the earth, filling them with treasures, palaces, and rivers of mercury said to shimmer like real waterways. The tomb was a universe unto itself, a place where the emperor could rule forever, even if his body failed. If immortality eluded him in life, he would seize it in death. But here's the bitter irony. In chasing immortality, he accelerated his mortality. The constant consumption of toxic elixirs, the endless paranoia, the strain of ceaseless travel and construction, all of it wore him down. Instead of granting him eternal life, his obsession likely shortened the years he had. And yet, his fear was not irrational. He sensed, perhaps more keenly than most rulers, how fragile his achievement was. He knew his dynasty was young, untested, and hated by many of his subjects. He feared that once he was gone, the empire might unravel. In that fear, he wasn't wrong. His paranoia wasn't just personal, it was political. He understood that he was the linchpin, the iron will holding everything together. Without him, what then? So Qin Shi Huang wandered his empire, restless, seeking cures, demanding loyalty, commanding eternity. His fleets sailed to nowhere. His alchemists brewed poison in gilded cups. His tomb swallowed treasure and lives. And through it all, he remained terrified of the one enemy he could not command. There's something profoundly human in this. For all his cruelty, for all his grandeur, the first emperor was still a man staring into the abyss. He had built an empire that seemed eternal, yet he could not bear the thought of his own bones turning to dust. And in that, he was no different from the peasants he ruled, who also feared death, though they had no luxury of alchemists or tombs. The difference was scale. Where a farmer might pray to ancestors, Qin Shi Huang sent fleets across oceans. Where a villager might drink herbal teas for health, the emperor swallowed mercury-laced potions. The fear was the same. The response was colossal. In the end, the quest for immortality didn't save him. But it left behind monuments, terracotta soldiers, whispered legends, rivers of mercury underground that still speak of his obsession. If immortality means being remembered, then in a way, he succeeded. His name, his tomb, his soldiers, these remain etched in history, long after the elixirs turned to dust. The Qin Dynasty looked invincible from the outside. Walls stretched across the frontiers, armies stood in disciplined ranks, and the emperor's decrees carried across thousands of miles. But inside the palace at Xianyang, politics was just as dangerous as the battlefields the emperor had conquered. Courtiers whispered in corridors, eunuchs carried secrets, and ministers weighed loyalty against ambition. The empire's heart was a court where one wrong word could end a career or a life. The emperor's suspicion, Qin Shi Huang's paranoia fed these intrigues. He trusted almost no one. Ministers could rise to dizzying heights of influence one day and be executed the next. Officials lived in a constant state of anxiety, knowing that their rivals were eager to denounce them for mistakes, real or imagined. This atmosphere of suspicion made the court a breeding ground for manipulation. If you wanted to rise, you had to master not only law and administration, but also survival in a world where the emperor's moods mattered as much as your merits. Li Si, the architect and manipulator chief among the emperor's advisors, was Li Si, a legalist thinker whose influence shaped much of Qin's policy. Li Si wasn't just a bureaucrat, he was a survivor and a master of court politics. It was Li Si who urged the book burnings, who convinced the emperor to crush dissent, who turned legalist philosophy into iron law. But he was also cunning in how he preserved his own position. When rivals accused him of being too harsh, he doubled down on loyalty to the emperor, painting himself as the only man ruthless enough to defend Qin's greatness. And Qin Shi Huang, who valued results over compassion, often believed him. Li Si's brilliance kept him near the center of power, but it also sowed tension. Other officials feared him, hated him, and plotted against him. In Qin's court, loyalty to the emperor didn't prevent rivalry among ministers, it intensified it. With one throne at the center of the world, every official wanted to be closest to it. Eunuchs and palace power. Then there were the eunuchs, men who guarded the emperor's private chambers and controlled access to his person. Their role might have seemed humble at first, keeping order in the harem, delivering messages, but proximity is power, and eunuchs had plenty of both. They whispered in the emperor's ear when others were shut out, carried petitions and reports, and sometimes twisted those messages to suit their own agendas. A word from a eunuch could shape the emperor's perception of an official, for good or ill. Qin Shi Huang's paranoia made him vulnerable to this kind of manipulation. If a eunuch hinted that a minister was disloyal, suspicion could take root. If he praised another for loyalty, that official might rise. Eunuchs learned to play this game well, ensuring their survival in a court where ministers sometimes fell like wheat before a scythe. The emperor's family, a source of intrigue. The emperor's own family added to the instability. His mother, Lady Zhao, had earlier been implicated in scandals with powerful lovers and political allies. Though Qin Shi Huang distanced himself from her influence, the memory of that scandal left him wary of family entanglements. Later, his many sons became pawns in the question of succession. Who would inherit the empire built at such terrible cost? The emperor hesitated to name an heir, perhaps fearing that doing so would create factions. But by avoiding the question, he only ensured that intrigue would bloom the moment he died. Assassins and conspiracies. The assassination attempt by Jing Ke years earlier had left the emperor scarred, but plots didn't stop there. Rumors of conspiracies circulated constantly, some real, some fabricated by rivals to eliminate each other. A suspicious glance, a careless remark, a poorly worded letter, any of these could be twisted into evidence of treason. Executions followed quickly. Fear wasn't just the glue of the empire, it was the court's currency. A court that reflected the empire in a way, the intrigues inside the palace mirrored the empire outside. Just as peasants were controlled through laws and punishments, officials were controlled through suspicion and fear. Just as borders were held by walls, access to the emperor was held by eunuchs. The empire was a machine, and the court was its engine, full of grinding gears that could crush anyone caught between them. The seeds of collapse, ironically, the very centralization that made Qin powerful also made it fragile. Because everything depended on the emperor's personal will, courtiers learned to shape, twist, and manipulate that will. Policies weren't simply the product of reason, they were the outcome of whispered words, secret rivalries, and careful flattery. And when the emperor eventually died, those same courtiers, eunuchs, and ministers would seize control of succession, plunging the dynasty into chaos. But for now, while Qin Shi Huang lived, the court intrigue didn't topple the empire. It simmered, it whispered, it poisoned relationships, but the emperor's iron grip kept it in check. Still, anyone who looked closely could see the cracks forming. The empire was a colossus, yes, but its feet were clay, and many of those cracks started right in the emperor's palace, among the very men who claimed to serve him. The empire might have looked solid from a distance, but beneath the surface the strain was unbearable. Ordinary people, farmers, laborers, artisans, had carried the weight of Qin's grand vision for too long. Every new wall, every new road, every palace rising in Xianyang, every soldier marching to distant frontiers had been built with their sweat and, often, their lives. Taxes drained them, quotas broke them, conscription stole their sons, and forced labor consumed entire villages. For a time, fear kept them quiet. The punishments were too harsh, the surveillance too suffocating. But fear has limits. Push people far enough and fear turns to desperation, and desperation finds its voice in rebellion. The problem was simple. The people were exhausted. Harvests were disrupted because so many farmers were pulled away to work on the emperor's projects. Families who had once been able to scrape by found themselves slipping into starvation. When quotas weren't met, officials punished them with fines, whippings, or worse. Fields lay untended, canals clogged, yet the demands from the capital never eased. To the emperor, the empire's glory justified any sacrifice. To the people, it felt like suffocation. Small sparks began to appear. In villages where conscription had taken too many men, whispers spread about resisting officials. When a labor gang was marched off to work on the wall, some men tried to flee. Many were caught and executed, but the stories of their defiance traveled further than their bodies. Officials reported unrest, but the emperor and his ministers treated it as isolated trouble, not a systemic problem. They saw rebellion as weeds to be cut, not as proof that the soil itself was poisoned. The first flare-ups were scattered, easy to suppress. A group of farmers refusing conscription here, a band of deserters forming into outlaws there. But each time, the state's response was the same: brutal crackdowns. Whole villages punished, families executed, harsher quotas imposed. Instead of extinguishing the flames, this poured oil on them. The people learned that if they were going to suffer anyway, they might as well fight. The burden of Qin's expansion south and north added to the pressure. Soldiers sent to distant campaigns often never returned. Their families were left behind, fields collapsing without enough hands to tend them. When famine struck, resentment grew sharper. The emperor's road system, meant to unify the empire, now carried not only decrees and taxes, but also stories of discontent, spreading faster than before. What one province suffered, others soon heard. There's a kind of inevitability in it. You can rule by fear only as long as people believe obedience will keep them alive. But when obedience leads only to suffering, rebellion becomes less frightening than submission. That's the moment Qin faced in the final years of Qin Shi Huang's reign, and especially after his death. The peasants who had built his walls and roads began to turn against the very system that enslaved them. It wasn't just peasants either. Lower officials, trapped between the impossible demands of the state and the desperation of the people, sometimes joined in. Soldiers, weary of endless campaigns, mutinied rather than march again. Even within the tightly controlled bureaucracy, cracks appeared. The emperor had tried to make the state into a machine, every cog obedient, every gear aligned. But machines wear down when pushed too hard, and when they break catastrophically. By the time the dynasty faced full-scale uprisings, the roots of rebellion were already deep. The anger had been planted in every conscription order, every forced march, every lash of the whip on an exhausted laborer's back. For all his brilliance, Qin Shi Huang had never understood that fear and suffering alone can't hold an empire forever. He had conquered states, but he had not won the loyalty of the people who lived in them. And when rebellion finally burst into the open, it wasn't a sudden storm, it was the flood that had been building behind the dam all along. The first emperor's death came as both shock and inevitability. For years he had chased immortality, swallowing strange potions, dispatching expeditions to mythical isles, consulting alchemists and diviners. But no elixir could save him. In 210 BC, while traveling through the empire he had built, Qin Shi Huang fell ill and died on the road. The man who had declared himself eternal, the ruler who thought himself more than mortal, was undone by the same fate that claimed every farmer, soldier, and scholar he had ever ruled. His ministers, however, faced a terrifying problem. How do you announce the death of a man who had styled himself the everlasting emperor? The empire was vast, restless, and already straining under rebellion and labor. News of his death could spark chaos, embolden enemies, and unravel everything. So they decided to keep it secret, at least until they could return to the capital. The funeral procession became a macabre performance. The emperor's body, sealed in a carriage, began to rot in the summer heat. To mask the smell, officials ordered carts of salted fish to follow close behind, the stench of the fish disguising the stench of death. Soldiers marched as if nothing had changed. Decrees were still issued in the emperor's name, as though his voice continued to echo from the coffin. Every step was a lie, but one they believed necessary to preserve order until succession could be arranged. Behind this charade, intrigue boiled. Chief eunuch Zhao Gao and minister Li Si seized the opportunity. Together, they forged new decrees, reshaping the line of succession to favor the weak and pliable younger son, Hu Hai, instead of the more capable heir. The emperor's death gave them power, but only because they kept it hidden. The court on the road became a theater of manipulation, the corpse of Qin Shi Huang dragged silently at the center. The procession itself was eerie. Imagine the sight, an imperial convoy moving slowly along Qin's great roads, soldiers guarding the wagons, banners fluttering, and in the middle a sealed carriage carrying the body of a man who had believed himself untouchable. Ordinary people along the route bowed in respect, unaware that the emperor they honored was already gone. In their minds, the first emperor still lived, watching, commanding, punishing. In truth, he was ashes waiting to happen, and the empire he had built was beginning to crumble with him. There's a deep irony here. Qin Shi Huang had spent his life trying to control everything: laws, borders, people, even thoughts. Yet in death, he became powerless, a secret manipulated by those he had once commanded. The journey back to the capital wasn't just a funeral march, it was the beginning of the dynasty's unraveling. When the procession finally reached Xianyang, the body was interred in the colossal tomb complex that had consumed years of labor and countless lives. Rivers of mercury, terracotta armies, palaces underground, his afterlife empire awaited him. The burial was meant to seal his eternity, to keep him ruling even in death. But outside the tomb, his real empire was already cracking, torn by scheming officials, exhausted people, and growing rebellions. The first emperor had dreamed of ruling forever. Instead, he became a corpse dragged through the summer heat, hidden behind carts of fish. His death was the moment the mask slipped, when the empire that had seemed invincible revealed its fragility. With Qin Shi Huang gone, the empire he had welded together in blood and stone was suddenly rudderless. The man who had made every decision, who had centralized every thread of power into his own hands, left behind no clear succession plan. That vacuum was both opportunity and danger, and two men, Li Si, the chancellor, and Zhao Gao, the eunuch, moved swiftly to seize it. Li Si had been the emperor's most trusted minister, the architect of legalist policies that had shaped the empire. He was brilliant, ruthless, and practical. Zhao Gao, once a lowly palace eunuch, had clawed his way into influence by managing the emperor's inner court and the imperial household. Where Li Si wielded ideology and bureaucracy, Zhao Gao wielded proximity and manipulation. Together, they stood at the center of a storm. The question was succession. Qin Shi Huang's eldest son, Fusu, had been named heir. Fusu was no weakling. He had been sent to guard the northern frontier, where he was known for a streak of compassion unusual in Qin politics. He had even argued against the book burnings, angering his father but showing signs of moral courage. If Fusu became emperor, Qin might have softened, easing the crushing burdens on the people. But Fusu's sense of justice made him dangerous to men like Zhao Gao, whose power thrived on fear and deceit. So, in the days after the emperor's death, Zhao Gao whispered poison into Li Si's ear. Together they forged a decree in Qin Shi Huang's name, an order sent to Fusu, commanding him to commit suicide. Loyal to his father's authority and unable to question the authenticity of the decree, Fusu obeyed. With one stroke of forged ink, the rightful heir was dead, and the path cleared for another. The throne was handed to Huhai, a younger son of the emperor, inexperienced, pliable, and easily controlled. History would remember him as the second emperor of Qin, but in truth, his reign was little more than a puppet show. Zhao Gao and Li Si pulled the strings, and Huhai danced. At first, it seemed like a clever solution. With a malleable emperor on the throne, Zhao Gao could dominate court politics, while Li Si could continue steering the empire's vast bureaucracy. But this arrangement was inherently unstable. Zhao Gao and Li Si were allies only as long as their interests aligned. Both were ambitious, both suspicious, and both knew that power at the Qin court was a game of survival. Zhao Gao proved the more cunning. Slowly, he began undermining Li Si, painting him as untrustworthy, whispering doubts into the young emperor's ear. Huhai, overwhelmed by the responsibilities of rule and trapped in Zhao Gao's manipulative orbit, turned against the very chancellor who had built his father's empire. Li Si, once untouchable, was arrested, tortured, and executed, his body torn apart by the same brutal system of law he had championed. With Li Si gone, Zhao Gao stood unchallenged at the center of power. A eunuch who had once served in the shadows now controlled the most powerful empire on earth. It was a dizzying rise, but also a symbol of how far Qin had strayed from the iron will of its founder. The empire was no longer ruled by the first emperor's vision, but by court intrigues, forged decrees, and the paranoia of a weak successor. The irony is almost painful. Qin Shi Huang had built his empire on control, eliminating aristocrats, standardizing everything, enforcing laws with ruthless precision, all to prevent chaos when he was gone. Yet in concentrating so much power in himself, he ensured that once he was gone, the system had no stability of its own. The empire became the plaything of schemers. For the people outside the palace, nothing improved. Taxes remained heavy, labor demands continued, and rebellions spread like cracks through glass. But now, the central government was weaker, distracted by infighting. The hands that once gripped the empire with unyielding strength trembled, and the world began to notice. The Qin Dynasty had lost its anchor. In the shadow of the first emperor's tomb, the men he had trusted most tore at one another for control, even as the empire itself began to collapse beneath their feet. The new emperor, Huhai, history remembers him simply as the second emperor of Qin, was a young man suddenly handed the heaviest crown in the world. But unlike his father, he had neither the vision nor the iron will to carry it. He was thrust into a throne already poisoned by intrigue, surrounded by advisors who cared more for their own power than for the stability of the empire. The people were restless, the provinces smoldering, and instead of unifying through leadership, the second emperor became a tool in the hands of others. Zhao Gao, the eunuch who had maneuvered him into power, became his shadow. Huhai was inexperienced, impressionable, and terrified of losing his fragile grip on the throne. Zhao Gao whispered constantly in his ear, feeding his paranoia, convincing him that everyone, officials, generals, even family, was plotting against him. It worked. Huhai became more and more suspicious, seeing enemies in every corner, enemies that Zhao Gao conveniently offered to eliminate. Executions followed, swift and merciless. Ministers who had once commanded respect were cut down. Generals who had led Qin armies to glory were accused of treachery and removed. Every purge left Zhao Gao stronger. Every death stripped away another layer of the empire's competence. Li Si's death had already gutted the heart of Qin's bureaucracy, but with the second emperor's purges, the empire became leaderless in practice. Officials stopped offering advice or speaking openly in court. Silence was safer than honesty. Orders continued to flow, but they were contradictory, paranoid, detached from reality. One edict might demand harsher punishments for rebellion, while another might call for massive new projects even as rebellions raged unchecked. The clarity of Qin Shi Huang's rule gave way to confusion under his son, and confusion in an empire so vast is fatal. Meanwhile, the second emperor's legitimacy was weak from the start. Everyone in the court knew the succession had been manipulated. Fusu, the rightful heir, was dead by a forged decree, and whispers of that treachery spread beyond the palace. To many officials, Hu Hai was not the rightful ruler but a usurper propped up by Zhao Gao. To the people, he was worse than his father. At least Qin Shi Huang had been strong, if merciless. The second emperor was cruel without strength, suspicious without wisdom. Outside the capital, rebellions grew bolder. Reports of uprisings poured in from the provinces, peasants refusing quotas, deserters gathering into bands, leaders beginning to call for open revolt. The empire needed a decisive response, but the second emperor was trapped in Zhao Gao's web, more focused on imagined threats in the court than on the very real fires spreading through the countryside. He lashed out at subordinates instead of rebels, tightening his grip on officials even as his grip on the people slipped away. There's a tragic quality to his reign. He had inherited the mightiest empire the world had yet seen, but instead of wielding it, he hid behind palace walls, listening to whispers, blind to the storm gathering outside. In just a few years, the empire that had taken generations to forge began to unravel. The fear that had once glued Qin together no longer worked. Peasants feared starvation more than punishment. Soldiers feared their commanders less than they hated them. And officials feared Zhao Gao more than they respected the emperor. The second emperor became a symbol of weakness, a hollow ruler propped up by manipulation, his reign defined not by the expansion of Qin power but by its collapse. Where Qin Shi Huang had terrified his subjects into obedience, Hu Hai terrified his court into paralysis. And beyond the palace, rebellion was becoming not just possible but inevitable. It began with two men history might have otherwise forgotten, Chen Xing and Wu Guang. They weren't nobles, they weren't generals, they weren't men of great renown. They were low-ranking officers, leading a conscripted group of soldiers toward the northern frontier to reinforce Qin defenses. Just another routine dispatch in an empire of endless demands. But fate and weather intervened. Torrential rains delayed their journey, and the laws of Qin were merciless. Arriving late to a military assignment was punishable by death. That was the breaking point. Chen Xing and Wu Guang looked at their men, soaked and weary, and faced a simple truth. If they marched on and arrived late, they would all be executed. If they turned back, they'd be executed. If they did nothing, they'd be executed. In a system where the law left no room for error, rebellion suddenly seemed like the only rational choice. "We are dead men either way," one of them is said to have declared. Why not die fighting? So they turned their punishment into a banner. They rallied their conscripts, proclaimed themselves leaders of a cause greater than survival, and lit the spark that Qin had feared since its founding. Their rebellion began small, ragged, and desperate. But desperation has a way of spreading, especially in an empire already heavy with resentment. Farmers who had lost sons to forced labor joined them. Villagers broken by tax quotas took up makeshift weapons. Discontented soldiers deserted their posts to follow the rebel leaders. What started as a single band of mutineers became the first organized uprising against Qin rule. Chen Xing in particular had a gift for rhetoric. He framed their cause not as lawbreakers fleeing punishment, but as liberators rising against tyranny. He invoked the names of fallen states, appealing to the memory of Chu, Zhao, and others that Qin had destroyed. People who still carried bitterness for their lost kingdoms heard his words and rallied. For the first time since unification, the dream of independence returned. The rebellion spread like fire on dry grass. Villages rose, cities faltered, garrisons crumbled. The empire had built roads to connect itself. Now those same roads carried rebellion faster than officials could contain it. Qin armies were dispatched, but they found themselves outnumbered, demoralized, and facing not a single enemy, but countless small uprisings flaring in every direction. Suppressing one revolt only allowed 3 more to erupt elsewhere. Qin Shi even declared himself king of a revived Shu state, a bold move that signaled just how far the rebellion had grown. Though his reign would be brief, his declaration carried immense symbolic weight. Qin's claim to rule, all under heaven, was broken. Once a peasant could call himself king and gather thousands beneath his banner, the aura of Qin's invincibility shattered. It's worth pausing to see how this all connects. Qin Shi Huang's policies had made rebellion inevitable. The book burnings silenced voices, but not memories. The labor projects broke bodies, but not spirit. The harsh laws instilled fear, but also resentment. Qin Shi and Wu Guang weren't extraordinary men. They were ordinary enough that thousands could see themselves in their plight. And when ordinary men rise, they carry whole populations with them. The Qin response was brutal but ineffective. Executions, mass punishments, harsher laws, none of it worked. Fear had once kept the people quiet, but fear loses its grip once people feel they have nothing left to lose. Every rebel death was another martyr, every crackdown another reason to resist. Qin Shi himself would not live to see the empire's end, betrayed and killed by his own men after setbacks in battle, but it didn't matter. The fire he had lit was burning too brightly to be extinguished. His name became a rallying cry, his rebellion the template for others to follow. Qin was no longer facing scattered disobedience, it was facing civil war. From this point forward, the dynasty was doomed. The peasants who had built its walls were now tearing them down. The soldiers who had enforced its laws were now deserting to fight against them. The memory of lost kingdoms was reborn, each rebellion wrapping itself in the banner of restoring what Qin had destroyed. The great machine of legalism, fear, and uniformity was breaking apart, undone not by foreign invaders, but by the very people it had ruled. The irony is sharp. Qin Shi Huang had spent his life trying to make rebellion impossible, erasing local identities, imposing harsh punishments, surveilling his people. Yet in making life unbearable, he created the very conditions where rebellion became inevitable. Qin Shi and Wu Guang simply struck the first spark, but the empire was already soaked in fuel. Out of the chaos unleashed by Qin Shi and Wu Guang's uprising emerged 2 figures who would shape the collapse of Qin and the birth of what came next, Xiang Yu and Liu Bang. Their names would echo across history, not just as rebels, but as symbols of 2 very different kinds of leadership. One was a storm, violent, brilliant, devastating. The other was steady water, flexible, patient, quietly gathering strength until it swept the board. Xiang Yu came from the remnants of Chu nobility. He was young, physically imposing, and possessed a fiery temperament that matched his ferocity in battle. To his followers, he was a living echo of the old warrior aristocracy that Qin had crushed. Where Qin drilled armies into disciplined machines, Xiang Yu led with raw charisma, inspiring men to fight with a passion that machines could never replicate. His legend grew quickly, tales of him lifting cauldrons with his bare hands, of charging headlong into battle with a sword dripping blood. To peasants and disillusioned soldiers, he embodied vengeance, the hammer raised against Qin's tyranny. Liu Bang was different. He wasn't noble. He wasn't a great warrior in the traditional sense. He had once been a low-ranking official, responsible for minor duties like escorting convicts. He was easygoing, pragmatic, even a little rough around the edges. But he had a gift that mattered more than brute strength. People trusted him. He listened, he adapted, he let others shine. Where Xiang Yu inspired fear and awe, Liu Bang inspired loyalty. Men followed him not because he dazzled them in battle, but because they believed he would look after them, share their hardships, and not waste their lives. The 2 paths to power unfolded side by side as Qin's grip loosened. Xiang Yu carved his reputation through spectacular victories. He broke Qin armies with terrifying efficiency, his campaigns leaving a trail of destruction, but also of hope for those desperate to see Qin fall. Every city he liberated or destroyed proved that the first emperor's mighty walls and armies were not invincible. His fury was cathartic, a release for years of oppression. Liu Bang, meanwhile, built slowly. He gathered followers from the countryside, welcomed deserters, and forged alliances with other rebel leaders. He wasn't the strongest, but he was the most adaptable. He knew when to retreat, when to negotiate, when to fight. In a time of chaos, that flexibility was invaluable. Where others fought for revenge or glory, Liu Bang seemed to fight for survival, and survival in rebellion often meant victory. Together, these two men embodied the rebellion's transformation. Chen Sheng and Wu Guang had lit the first fire, but Xiang Yu and Liu Bang turned it into a blaze that consumed the dynasty. Qin armies, once the terror of all China, now faltered. They were stretched thin across too many uprisings, commanded by leaders more interested in palace politics than strategy, fighting enemies who refused to play by their rules. Discipline broke down. Morale collapsed. Soldiers deserted not just to escape punishment, but to join rebels who offered a cause worth dying for. The people, too, shifted their allegiance. When Xiang Yu smashed a Qin garrison, peasants cheered. When Liu Bang entered a city, officials often surrendered without a fight, hoping for leniency. Qin's fear-based system unraveled as fear itself lost its bite. The laws that had once terrified now seemed irrelevant. What mattered was whether you joined the tide rising against the dynasty. It's tempting to see Xiang Yu and Liu Bang as opposites, force versus patience, fury versus pragmatism, but in truth they were complementary forces in Qin's undoing. Xiang Yu shattered the empire's armies with his ferocity. Liu Bang laid the groundwork for what would replace Qin once the dust settled. One destroyed, the other built. Without Xiang Yu, the dynasty might have lingered longer. Without Liu Bang, its fall might have led only to endless fragmentation. For Qin, their rise was a nightmare. For China, it was the beginning of a new story. The rebellion was no longer a scattered cry of pain. It had leaders, armies, momentum. Qin's days were numbered, not by distant enemies, but by men who had once been ordinary and now carried the hopes of millions. The stage was set for the empire's collapse, not in one sudden blow, but in a relentless pounding, Xiang Yu's hammer strikes and Liu Bang's steady advance. Qin had built its rule on fear, but fear was gone. In its place came fury and resilience, embodied in two men who would reshape history long after Qin's ashes cooled. The Qin armies had once been unstoppable, disciplined, drilled, hardened by years of war in the warring states. They had marched in lockstep, their formations precise, their generals ruthless. That was how Qin conquered China, sheer military efficiency. But now, as rebellion flared across the empire, those same armies began to crumble. It wasn't a sudden collapse, more like rot spreading from within, weakening the structure until it gave way. At first, commanders responded with the same tactics that had brought Qin victory in the past. Swift, brutal suppression. Rebels were hunted, villages punished, deserters executed. But something had changed. Soldiers conscripted to fight for the dynasty no longer believed in the cause. Many of them had families starving back home, fields neglected because men were pulled into endless campaigns or labor gangs. Every step they marched to suppress rebellion was a step further from the farms they might never see again. Their loyalty to Qin was thin, their resentment thick. Morale sagged. Armies that once fought with machine-like precision now hesitated, broke formation, or deserted outright. Some soldiers, ordered to crush peasants in revolt, looked across the battlefield and saw faces just like their own farmers, brothers, neighbors. Why kill them for an emperor buried in a palace tomb, for officials who lined their pockets while common men bled? The answer for many was simple: don't. They laid down their arms, switched sides, or melted into the countryside. Commanders grew desperate. Reports to the capital became more frantic, filled with excuses and warnings. But the second emperor and Zhao Gao were too consumed with palace intrigue to offer real strategy. Orders sent from Xianyang were contradictory, paranoid, sometimes even absurd. A general might be told to execute deserters, then to grant pardons, then to launch massive offensives with armies that no longer existed in full strength. Confusion spread as surely as rebellion. Against this backdrop, leaders like Xiang Yu and Liu Bang became even more formidable. Xiang Yu's ferocity broke Qin armies that lacked the will to fight. His victories spread fear among officials, but stirred courage among rebels. Liu Bang's pragmatism turned Qin soldiers into allies. When he entered cities, garrisons sometimes opened their gates rather than resist. The Qin military machine, once feared across all China, now bled strength with every campaign. The collapse of morale wasn't just about soldiers. It was about the entire system that supported them. Supply lines faltered because peasants refused to hand over grain. Taxes went unpaid. Roads, once celebrated as Qin's arteries of empire, became pathways for rebel bands moving faster than imperial detachments could respond. In some provinces, the emperor's authority simply evaporated. Officials abandoned their posts, leaving power to whoever could seize it. Fear had been the engine of Qin discipline, but fear only works when people believe the state is stronger than they are. Once they saw it falter, once they realized armies could be beaten, that engine sputtered out. The spell of Qin invincibility was broken. An empire that had conquered all of China in less than 2 decades now struggled to defend its own heartlands. What made it worse was that Qin Shi Huang's system had no flexibility. It was built to be rigid, absolute, unquestioned. There was no space for negotiation, no tolerance for compromise. Once cracks appeared, the state had no tools to adapt. It could only command, punish, and demand obedience that fewer and fewer were willing to give. The armies faltered, morale broke, and with each defeat the rebellion grew bolder. The empire's great military legacy, the very thing that had birthed Qin, became the stage of its unraveling. The first emperor had forged weapons sharper than any rival, but in the hands of his successors, those weapons turned dull, brittle, and finally useless. Xianyang, the dazzling capital of the Qin Dynasty, had been built to awe. Palaces stretched in glittering rows, filled with lacquered halls, rare woods, golden ornaments, and silken banners. Roads radiated outward like veins from the city's heart, carrying the emperor's decrees to the farthest corners of the realm. To step inside Xianyang was to step into Qin Shi Huang's vision of eternity, grand, unyielding, meant to outshine all who came before. But grandeur has a way of becoming a target. When rebellion reached the city's walls, it wasn't just about conquest. It was about revenge. The palaces that had symbolized power to the Qin also symbolized suffering to the people who had built them under lash and chain. Every gilded beam, every jade ornament was stained with the sweat and bones of countless laborers. So when the rebels finally broke through, they didn't come as conquerors seeking to preserve a throne. They came as avengers determined to erase it. The city burned. Accounts say the flames devoured Xianyang's palaces for days, rising so high they seemed to touch the sky. Roof beams cracked and collapsed, sending showers of sparks into the night. Walls painted with imperial decrees blackened and peeled. Statues of dragons, phoenixes, and ancestors melted into twisted shapes. The city that had once embodied Qin's might became a furnace, its glory reduced to ash. For the rebels, the destruction was deliberate. This wasn't just about toppling a dynasty, it was about annihilating its memory. By burning Xianyang, they erased Qin's physical symbols of power, leaving nothing for later rulers to inherit or admire. The palaces that had drained the empire's lifeblood were consumed in the same kind of fire Qin Shi Huang had once ordered for books. It was a grim symmetry. Where the emperor had burned ideas, the people now burned his monuments. And yet, the loss was staggering. Qin Shi Huang had filled his capital with treasures, priceless works of art, archives of administration, records of his standardizations, the material culture of a unified empire. All of it went up in smoke. Future dynasties would inherit Qin's systems, but not its grandeur. The physical evidence of his reign vanished in the flames, leaving only fragments, whispers, and ruins. The burning of Xianyang also symbolized the collapse of fear. Once, the capital had been untouchable, the heart of an empire that seemed immortal. But fire consumes more than wood and stone, it consumes illusions. As the palaces crumbled, so too did the image of Qin as invincible. The dynasty's mystique was gone, its aura of permanence reduced to flickering embers. Imagine the sight for those who witnessed it. Smoke thickening the air, embers swirling like fireflies, the sound of collapsing timbers echoing through the night. For some, it must have been terrifying, a sign that the world itself was unraveling. For others, it was liberating, proof that tyranny could fall. For everyone, it was unforgettable. The fall of Xianyang marked the point of no return. Even if Qin armies had managed to rally, even if the second emperor had found his backbone, the dynasty could never recover the legitimacy it lost in that blaze. Power can be rebuilt, but awe, once destroyed, cannot be conjured again. The burning of the capital was more than destruction, it was humiliation. And it carried a lesson. The very monuments Qin had built to glorify itself became the fuel for its undoing. The people who had been forced to labor on palaces and roads now watched them burn, their suffering avenged in fire. Qin Shi Huang had dreamed of eternity, but eternity went up in smoke with his capital. With the capital in flames and rebellion surging on every front, the Qin dynasty had little left to cling to. The second emperor, manipulated into paranoia by Zhao Gao, had lost the loyalty of his court, his armies, and his people. Betrayals stacked upon betrayals, and soon even Zhao Gao, the cunning eunuch who had orchestrated so much of the chaos, met his end, devoured by the very schemes he had sown. What remained of the once mighty dynasty was a hollow throne. Into that void stepped Ziying, a relative of the royal family. The records disagree about his exact position. Some say he was the nephew of Qin Shi Huang, others a younger son of Fusu, but what is clear is that he inherited an empire already reduced to embers. The armies were broken, the capital destroyed, the people in open revolt, and rival leaders like Xiang Yu and Liu Bang rising with unstoppable momentum. Ziying's rule was less a reign and more a final act of desperation. He had little choice but to take the crown, for someone had to wear it, if only to prevent the empire from unraveling completely overnight. But unlike Qin Shi Huang, who had declared himself eternal, or the second emperor, who had flailed in paranoia, Ziying seemed to recognize the futility of his position. He did not strut as a conqueror or scheme as a manipulator. He simply tried to survive. When Xiang Yu and Liu Bang pressed closer, the question was no longer whether Qin would fall, but how. Xiang Yu was merciless, known for annihilating Qin armies and burning cities without hesitation. Liu Bang, though no less determined, had a reputation for leniency, for accepting surrender instead of demanding destruction. Ziying must have known these differences, must have weighed them as he faced the reality that resistance was impossible. In 206 BCE, only 15 years after Qin Shi Huang had declared the empire eternal, Ziying surrendered to Liu Bang. It was a symbolic moment, the last emperor of Qin bowing not to a foreign invader, but to a former peasant official, a man who represented the very people Qin had crushed under its projects and laws. The surrender was quiet, almost anticlimactic compared to the fury of rebellion that had come before. No grand battle decided it, no desperate last stand. Just a recognition that the dynasty was finished. But surrender didn't guarantee mercy. Xiang Yu, furious that Liu Bang had accepted Ziying's submission, later ordered Ziying's execution, along with the slaughter of Qin's remaining royal family. To Xiang Yu, Qin deserved no trace of survival. The dynasty that had burned books, buried scholars, and enslaved its people should be erased entirely. And so it was. Ziying's death closed the final chapter. The image is stark. The first emperor had dreamed of ruling for 10,000 generations, yet within a single generation his throne was gone, his palace's ashes, his descendants slain. The man who had once terrified all under heaven left behind a dynasty that couldn't even survive his funeral. Ziying's surrender and death capture the tragic irony of Qin. Its greatest strength, absolute centralization, fear, and control, became its fatal weakness. When the center faltered, nothing held the rest together. The dynasty collapsed not because its enemies were stronger, but because its own foundations were brittle. Ziying wasn't a weak man so much as he was a man born too late, handed an empire already broken. His role was not to rule, but to preside over its end. And so, the dynasty that had declared itself eternal collapsed in just 15 years. Think about that, 15. A blink compared to the centuries of Zhou that came before, or the centuries of Han that would follow. Qin Shi Huang had carved his name into history with roads, walls, laws, and armies, yet all of it unraveled almost as quickly as it had been built. The empire that seemed invincible proved to be as fragile as clay. The reasons were many, but they all traced back to the same flaw: Qin ruled by fear, not loyalty. Its achievements were immense, but they were imposed, not embraced. Standardized script, coins, and measures survived, but not because the people loved Qin, because those systems were practical and useful, inherited by later dynasties. Qin's own political structure, built on crushing labor, merciless law, and unrelenting paranoia, had no room to bend. And when it could not bend, it broke. The rebellions that spread after Qinsheng and Wu Guang were not isolated. They were the collective cry of a people pushed beyond endurance. Every forced march to build a wall, every quota that starved a family, every execution for a minor offense had planted seeds of resentment. When those seeds sprouted, they grew faster than Qin could cut them down. By the time Ziying surrendered, the dynasty wasn't merely defeated, it was despised. The fall was messy, violent, and humiliating. Palaces that had once gleamed with gold were piles of ash. The royal family was slaughtered, its blood staining the very stones it had forced peasants to lay. The terracotta army stood in silence underground, guarding a tomb while the empire above it vanished. Soldiers who had once marched in disciplined ranks either deserted or joined the rebels. Officials who had once bragged of their loyalty fled or switched sides. What makes Qin's collapse so striking is the speed of it. Most empires decay slowly, rotting over decades before finally toppling. Qin's end was sudden, like a tree struck by lightning. It had risen quickly through reforms, wars, and centralization, but those same traits, speed, harshness, inflexibility, made it brittle. The dynasty was a sword, sharp and powerful, but one that shattered the moment it was struck hard enough. Yet, even in its failure, Qin left a mark that could not be erased. Later dynasties learned from its mistakes. The Han, who inherited the ruins, kept Qin's centralized systems but softened them with Confucian ideals, balancing legalist order with moral persuasion. They kept the script, the coins, the roads, the bureaucracy, but abandoned the merciless extremes. In that sense, Qin's fall was not the end of its vision, but the pruning of it. What was unbearable died, what was useful endured. For the people who lived through it, though, those lessons meant little. All they saw was the dynasty's collapse in fire and blood. Families who had lost sons to labor gangs must have felt grim satisfaction when Qin palaces burned. Scholars who had hidden scraps of forbidden texts must have smiled bitterly as the regime that silenced them was itself silenced. Soldiers who had once trembled at Qin's commands now stood free of them, choosing their own banners to fight under. 15 years. That was all the eternity Qin Shi Huang achieved in life. His monuments lasted longer, his tomb still sits sealed, his clay army still waits underground. But his dynasty, the thing he believed would rule for 10,000 generations, was gone almost before it began. When the dust of Qin's collapse settled, something remarkable happened. Instead of rejecting everything the dynasty had built, the new powers that rose, most notably the Han, kept much of it. But they didn't keep the cruelty. And that made all the difference. Qin had unified China through fear, crushing dissent, and forcing people into obedience. It worked for a while. But once the dynasty fell, the bitterness it left behind was so deep that no successor could hope to rebuild on the same foundation. Xiangyu tried, with brute force and spectacle, but his harshness reminded people too much of what they had just endured. Liu Bang, on the other hand, understood the lesson: you could not hold a nation together with fear alone. You had to offer something the people could believe in. That was Qin's strange legacy. It taught its successors exactly what not to do. Its cruelty became the foil against which Han legitimacy was built. Where Qin executed scholars and burned books, the Han elevated Confucian texts, honoring moral teaching alongside statecraft. Where Qin taxed and conscripted peasants until they broke, the Han reduced burdens, presenting themselves as benevolent guardians rather than tyrants. Where Qin's emperors saw themselves as untouchable gods on earth, the Han tempered that image with ritual, virtue, and rhetoric about the mandate of heaven. People remembered the pain of Qin vividly, and the Han leaned into that memory. By positioning themselves as the antidote to Qin's brutality, they earned legitimacy quickly. Liu Bang, later Emperor Gaozu, was a commoner turned emperor, a man of the people in a way Qin Shi Huang had never been. That mattered. Ordinary families could see themselves in him. He promised order, yes, but also compassion. Compared to Qin's iron grip, his reign felt like a release of pressure. And yet, the Han were shrewd. They didn't throw away Qin's entire system. They kept the centralized bureaucracy, the standardized script, the unified weights and measures, the roads that bound provinces to the capital. These were practical, powerful tools for governing a vast territory. But by softening the edge, replacing terror with moral authority, they turned Qin's brittle machinery into something more flexible, something capable of lasting centuries instead of years. In this way, Qin's cruelty paved the road for Han's success. Qin had shown the limits of fear. The Han capitalized on that lesson. Qin had demonstrated the usefulness of centralized control. The Han refined it. Qin's failure became Han's legitimacy, and later dynasties would repeat this cycle, keeping Qin's bones, discarding its flesh. For the people, this shift mattered deeply. After 15 years of living under a dynasty that demanded everything and gave nothing, the Han's relative leniency felt like mercy. Taxes eased, labor conscriptions lessened, intellectual life revived. Confucian scholars who had hidden their texts now brought them out into the open, shaping a new cultural identity that would last for centuries. The trauma of Qin became a warning story, told and retold. Do not rule by fear alone. The irony is striking. Qin Shi Huang had wanted his dynasty to endure for 10,000 generations, but it lasted barely more than a decade. And yet, by failing so spectacularly, he ensured that his successors would succeed. Qin's cruelty was the rock against which Han legitimacy was sharpened, the cautionary tale that defined Chinese political thought for centuries. The first emperor had unified China with an iron fist. The Han would hold it together with a blend of that iron and something softer: ritual, morality, persuasion. Qin built the skeleton, Han gave it flesh. Without Qin's harshness, the Han might not have seemed so benevolent. Without Qin's failure, the Han might not have known how to last. In that sense, Qin's cruelty achieved a strange immortality. Not through the dynasty itself, but through the way it shaped everything that came after. Legalism didn't die with the Qin dynasty. For all the hatred directed at Qin Shi Huang's brutality, for all the horror at book burnings, forced labor, and merciless punishments, the philosophy that had powered his empire lingered like a shadow over Chinese governance. In fact, it never truly went away. It was too useful. At its core, legalism was brutally simple. People cannot be trusted to act virtuously on their own. Left to themselves, they will follow self-interest, drift into disorder, and undermine stability. Therefore, the state must control them with clear laws, strict punishments, and rewards for obedience. It is not about inspiring people to be good. It is about forcing them to be orderly. Qin took that philosophy to its extreme, and it collapsed. But later dynasties realized that legalism, in moderation, was indispensable. The Han made this balance explicit. Outwardly, they embraced Confucianism, elevating scholars, teaching filial piety, and emphasizing morality as the foundation of the state. Confucianism became the public face of the empire, the ideology taught in schools, carved into rituals, and praised in proclamations. But behind the curtain, in the machinery of law and bureaucracy, legalism still ruled. Officials were monitored, laws enforced, quotas demanded. The Han softened the harshness, but never abandoned the structure. That became the enduring pattern: Confucianism as the soul of the state, legalism as its bones. One spoke of virtue, harmony, and the mandate of heaven. The other made sure taxes were collected, criminals punished, and armies supplied. This duality shaped Chinese governance for centuries, a synthesis born directly from Qin's failure. Even in later dynasties, the Tang, the Ming, the Qing, the same tension remained. The emperors presented themselves as moral fathers to their people, benevolent and virtuous. But their administrations still ran on legalist principles, centralized control, standardized law, rewards, and punishments as the levers of power. Qin may have fallen, but its philosophy was immortal in practice. There's something deeply ironic about this. Qin Shi Huang tried to erase other schools of thought, burning Confucian texts and burying scholars. Yet it was Confucianism that outlived him, becoming the public ideology of the empire. Legalism, meanwhile, survived not in name, but in action. Few dynasties openly praised it. It was too tainted by Qin's reputation, but they relied on it every day. It was the skeleton under the skin, the machinery humming beneath the Confucian facade. And that's Qin's strange gift to history. Its cruelty showed what happens when legalism is left unchecked, when the state is all punishment and no persuasion. But its efficiency showed why no dynasty could abandon it entirely. Without legalist discipline, the bureaucracy would falter. Without clear laws and strict enforcement, provinces would drift into independence. Without surveillance and accountability, corruption would rot the system. Qin proved that legalism worked, it just needed the tempering influence of something softer. Even today, echoes remain. The idea that the state must be strong, that order requires discipline, that law is more reliable than virtue. These are legalist legacies, born in Qin, refined in Han, and woven into centuries of governance. The dynasty may have burned out quickly, but its philosophy became part of China's political DNA. So when we speak of Qin's fall, we should also speak of its endurance. Not the endurance of its rulers or palaces, which crumbled, but of its ideas, which outlived the dynasty by millennia. Qin's cruelty paved the way for Han legitimacy, yes, but its legalism paved the way for the very structure of empire itself. Qin failed, but legalism survived quietly, persistently, shaping history long after the terracotta soldiers had been buried in silence. For all its brutality and short life, Qin left behind monuments and myths that outlasted its dynasty by millennia. Some were physical, stone, earth, clay, that could be seen and touched. Others were stories, half history, half legend, whispered and retold until they became part of China's cultural fabric. In this way, Qin achieved a strange immortality. The empire itself collapsed, but its shadows lingered. The most famous relic is the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, buried beneath a massive mound near modern Xi'an. Guarding it is the terracotta army, thousands of life-sized clay soldiers, each unique, lined in endless ranks with horses, chariots, and weapons. They stand frozen in silence, waiting for orders that will never come. Discovered in 1974 by farmers digging a well, the terracotta army stunned the world, a reminder of the first emperor's obsession with eternity. It's haunting to think of, while his dynasty crumbled above, his clay soldiers endured underground, their faces unbroken by time. Then there is the Great Wall. Qin did not build the wall we picture today. That came later, under Ming, but it did lay the foundations. By linking and extending existing regional walls, Qin created the first version of a barrier stretching across the northern frontier. It was crude compared to later fortifications, but symbolically it mattered. The wall was not just defense, it was a statement that Qin's reach extended to the very edge of the world. Generations would add, rebuild, and expand it, but the idea of the Great Wall began with Qin. Roads and canals were another enduring legacy. Qin's vast network of straight, standardized roads tied the empire together, radiating from Xianyang like spokes on a wheel. They allowed armies to move quickly, messages to travel fast, trade to flow more easily. Even after the dynasty fell, those roads remained, used by Han, Tang, and beyond. They stitched China into something closer to a single organism. Qin may have died, but its arteries still pulsed. Yet Qin's endurance isn't only in stone and earth. Its myths lingered too, often dark, often cautionary. The story of Qin Shi Huang sending ships to the eastern seas in search of immortals, never to return, became legend. Tales of rivers of mercury flowing through his tomb fueled imaginations for centuries, turning his resting place into a mystery that still captures archaeologists and storytellers alike. The book burnings, the burial of scholars, the crushing of dissent, these became moral warnings told by Confucian historians, shaping how later generations saw tyranny. It's striking how memory worked against Qin. Its rulers wanted to be remembered as eternal, as godlike figures. Instead, they were remembered as warnings. The myths of their cruelty overshadowed their accomplishments, even as those accomplishments quietly endured in infrastructure and governance. People told stories of the first emperor's paranoia, of Zhao Gao's manipulation, of palaces burning in Xianyang. Those tales made Qin less a dynasty to admire and more a specter to fear, a name invoked when rulers grew too harsh. But myths can be powerful in ways monuments cannot. A palace can burn, but a story spreads. And in that sense, Qin did achieve a strange kind of immortality. Its ruins and legends shaped how later dynasties defined themselves, how they justified their policies, how they reassured their people, we are not Qin. We are better. We learned from their mistakes. Qin lived on not as a model, but as a mirror. When we look at Qin's endurance, it's a paradox. Its physical monuments, the wall, the roads, the tomb, outlasted the dynasty. Its myths of cruelty, of excess, of collapse, outlasted even those monuments. Together they formed a legacy no emperor could ignore. Qin was gone, but Qin was everywhere, in the earth, in the stories, in the political DNA of China itself. The Qin story ends where it began, with a paradox. Qin Shi Huang unified China, something no ruler before him had accomplished. He tore down the walls between states, standardized scripts and measures, built roads and canals, and for the first time bound all under heaven under a single authority. That achievement shaped China forever. Yet the very methods he used, fear, forced labor, merciless punishment, ensured his dynasty's collapse almost as soon as it was born. Qin succeeded by tyranny, and it failed for the same reason. There's a lesson in that contradiction. Unity achieved through cruelty is brittle. It can build quickly, but it cannot endure. Qin's laws were clear, its punishments severe, its bureaucracy efficient. But none of that earned loyalty. People obeyed out of terror, not trust. And when fear cracked, when rebellion seemed less terrifying than obedience, the whole structure collapsed. The dynasty's power was absolute, but it had no roots in the hearts of its people. And yet, Qin's failure was not total. Its centralization, its legal codes, its infrastructure, all of these outlived it. Later dynasties learned from Qin's mistakes, but also from its successes. The Han tempered legalist efficiency with Confucian morality. They ruled not just with punishment, but with persuasion, ritual, and ideology. Qin was remembered as a warning, but it was also remembered as the foundation of the imperial system that followed. Even today, Qin Shi Huang looms large in memory. Some see him as a visionary who forged a nation, others as a tyrant who burned and buried to maintain control. Both views are true. His tomb, still unopened, is a symbol of that duality, a wonder of engineering and imagination, and a reminder of the lives consumed to build it. His clay army stands in silence, an eternal guard for a man who could not escape death. The paradox is this: without Qin's tyranny, China might never have been unified. Without Qin's unification, later dynasties might never have flourished. Qin's fall cleared the path for systems that could last centuries. Its cruelty destroyed it, but its achievements shaped a civilization. So when we tell the story of the Qin dynasty, it is not just the story of a failure. It is the story of a dynasty that burned bright and brief, whose brutality toppled it, but whose vision endured. A dynasty remembered less for its reign than for the questions it left behind. How far can fear go in holding a people together? How much cruelty can an empire bear before it collapses? Can unification be built on the backs of suffering, or must it rest on something deeper? Qin's answer was in its palaces, its tombs, its walls, all of which remind us that empires can rise through tyranny, but they cannot last by it. The paradox of Qin is that it failed completely, and yet it succeeded beyond its wildest dreams. For though the dynasty is long gone, the unified China it created remains.